It's September 2007 on the campus of North Carolina Central University. In an apartment nearby, a 22-year-old college student named Stephen is waiting for a friend.
Stephen was a basketball player at NCCU. Very handsome guy, a big, brawny guy. He was from Baltimore, so he had that Baltimore swag about him. And I'm sure some of these young girls down here in the South probably dug that.
Stephen is in his senior year and is determined to enjoy every last carefree moment.
Of course, as a senior, he's been around, so he knows the lay of the land.
Romantically, Stephen has made the most of his college years, bouncing from girl to girl.
Stephen is a real hot commodity on campus. He dates around. He might be a little bit of a player, but he's also a gentleman.
He's seen lots of different women, but there is one he keeps coming back to. Her name is Velma.
Velma was attractive, presented very well, very nice lady.
I know I told you about bringing that ball up here.
What you gonna do about it?
They didn't necessarily consider themselves boyfriend and girlfriend in the traditional sense. They described it as friends with benefits. These two were just kind of like bosom buddies with a little extracurricular activity on the side.
They knew not to take anything too seriously. They were in college and they were having a good time, and that's probably what attracted the two of them.
Velma knows the relationship is casual, but she's unaware of the other women in Stephen's life. And that's not his only secret. At the start of the fall semester, Stephen is homeless.
Stephen was not on a basketball scholarship, and financially he was having problems.
Years of college tuition fees have completely wiped out Stephen's finances.
He was broke, was evicted from his apartment. He was living in his car, didn't know what he was going to do, and certainly needed a job.
Stephen is desperately hoping for a change in his fortunes. And in October 2007, he finally catches a break. It comes in the form of 40-year-old preacher Robert Reeves.
Reeves was in the ministry. He was a pastor.
Robert Reeves is about 5'6". He's got dark hair, he's African-American, wears glasses.
Given his religious background, Reeves insists Stephen call him by a preferred nickname.
Mr. Reeves liked to be called the bishop because he saw himself as a man of the cloth.
Stephen met the bishop earlier in the summer. The pair became fast friends after Stephen had confided in him about his money woes.
Once Reeves learns that Stephen is on some hard times financially, he says, well, you know, I have a house. Why don't you come and live with me?
Even better, Reeves says he can help Stephen find a part-time job to help make the $300 rent payments.
Reeves said he knew of some way that he could make some money as an intern or a researcher of some kind.
Stephen gratefully accepts the generous offer, and in early October, he settles into the basement bedroom of Reeves' stately Durham home. And with his financial issues seemingly resolved, he's free to enjoy college life once more. And later that fall, the handsome athlete arouses the interest of another classmate, 21-year-old Latrice Curtis.
Latrice Curtis is a very attractive young lady, very personable, and her and Stephen really hit it off.
She was a go-getter. She was the type child that set her mind to something, and she's not going to quit until she accomplishes that.
This friendship between Latrice and Stephen developed in the classroom through studying together, spending time socially together.
And Stephen has even opened up to her about his recent troubles.
In Latrice, he finds a confidant, somebody he can share his problems with when you begin to share your personal feelings with somebody else of the opposite sex. It does create this great tension.
Because of their growing friendship, Stephen has been honest with Latrice that he's not looking for anything serious romantically.
I don't think he wanted to engage in any kind of relationship that would have any effect on his flexibility and his future plans.
But Latrice doesn't care about that. She likes Stephen, and she wants to see more of him.
Stephen may have other girls on the side, but Latrice really wanted to pursue this. She wanted to be the one that landed him. She's going to convert him from being a player.
In late October, 2 weeks after moving in with the bishop, Stephen invites Latrice over for a study date. Now that he finally has his own place, Stephen plans to take full advantage of his newfound privacy to get intimate with Latrice.
They were, perhaps studying or just hanging out and talking, and then one thing led to another.
Things build and build, and when you get to the right moment, the dam bursts. We feel like this is how we need to express ourselves to each other.
It's the first time Stephen and Latrice have had sex with each other, and the new lovers give themselves over to the intense pleasure of being together.
This wasn't just a random fling for her. Clearly, the sexual attraction was very profound, and mix that with a genuine friendship, a comfort level that she must have felt with him. One has to wonder, was she looking at Stephen in a new way?
But for Stephen, the exciting afternoon he spent with Latrice hasn't changed anything from his perspective.
While Stephen cares for Latrice, it certainly does not appear that Stephen is interested in a long-term, steady, monogamous relationship at that point.
For the moment, he's just reveling in the freedom of his new living situation, forgetting how his actions might be perceived by one important person, his pious new housemate, the bishop.
So after Stephen and Latrice have sex, she leaves, and then Stephen has a conversation with his landlord, the bishop. The bishop wants to know, you just have sex with that girl?
The bishop saw Latrice go into Stephen's room and knows all too well what's been going on.
In Stephen's mind, the bishop is concerned about my soul. He doesn't want me out here committing fornication.
The bishop leaves the matter there, but it's given Stephen the distinct impression he's crossed a big line.
Is it going to be difficult for him to bring home girlfriends when he's living with a man of the cloth? And how is he going to resolve any conflict if the bishop disapproves of his extracurricular activities?
But it turns out Stephen isn't the only one sneaking around. His new lover, Latrice, has a shocking secret of her own. Despite pursuing Stephen, she is in fact married.
Latrice Curtis told him she was separated from her husband, when in fact she was a newlywed.
Latrice only exchanged vows with Darren a few months earlier. And to their families, the couple still seemed to be very much in love.
Darren, most women would call him a catch. He was working part-time, taking classes at NC State, and he was in the National Guard Reserves as well.
He just seemed to be the right one for her because he was a go-getter, and so was she. They seemed like they're just the ideal couple.
And Darren would be furious if he knew about his wife's secret life.
As far as Darren knows, his wife is in school and she works part-time, and they are living a typical marriage.
But will it stay that way? Another person completely in the dark about Stephen's new relationship with Latrice is Velma.
Her idea of their relationship was that they were good friends and that they, from time to time, engaged in sexual intercourse, but she did not necessarily think that he had other girlfriends that he was having intercourse with.
But popular ladies' man Stephen is blissfully unaware of the potential storm he's whipping up. In his eyes, by the end of the fall semester, everything in his life is falling into place. He has a roof over his head and is having exciting sexual relationships with two beautiful women, Latrice and Velma.
Stephen is personally validated by the number of women that he could have sexual relations with. That's a huge ego boost.
It all seems too good to be true. And unfortunately for Stephen, that's exactly the case. He can't imagine just how quickly his fortunes can change. One day in December, Stephen picks up an unexpected phone call. He doesn't recognize the voice on the other end of the line, but the sinister tone leaves no doubt as to the caller's intention.
Stephen begins getting threatening phone calls, and it shows up on his cell phone as a blocked number. In one of those phone calls, there was a reference to they thought he needed a gun, or he better have a gun because he would need it.
Stephen hopes the eerie calls are a cruel teenage prank. But on December 11th, he learns they're far more serious.
Stephen is over visiting Velma. When he leaves to go home, he discovers that his tires have been cut on his car. There are other cars in the driveway and other cars on the street, and nobody else's car has been tampered with.
It's obvious that this is no accident.
There's somebody stalking him. He's been picked out. Somebody's followed him.
A dangerous game has been set in motion, but the rules will grow far more deadly, and the players are not who they seem. In the late fall of 2007, everything seems to be going great for handsome 22-year-old college senior Stephen. He's sleeping with his good friend, an attractive beauty named Velma, and he started a passionate after-hours affair with another classmate, Latrice Curtis.
It's this Hollywood stuff. Two pretty people, they meet, they hit it off. Clearly, there's a connection there.
And after weeks of living out of his car, he finally has a roof over his head, thanks to his minister mentor, Robert Reeves, a man he calls the Bishop.
Mr. Reeves offered to provide living quarters and also give him part-time employment so that he would be able to afford the rent.
But when Stephen's tires are slashed, he's left wondering if someone has it out for him. Despite their earlier run-in over Latrice, Stephen and the Bishop are still close. Now Stephen turns to his friend for help in dealing with a potential stalker.
Mr. Reeves is a rock for Stephen to lean on during this tough time.
Slice my tires.
But Reeves has some startling news of his own to report.
You know, that's real strange because there's been somebody...
He says some strange things have been happening at the house. Somebody's been ringing the doorbell and leaving.
It's left the minister rattled.
Listen.
Robert Reeves was very scared at this point.
And Stephen's feeling partly responsible for the situation.
Stephen's mind is like, man, I'm just a source of bad luck here. Everywhere I show up, these bad things seem to happen.
Reeves reassures his young tenant that together they can resolve his problems.
I don't want you to stress.
Mr. Reeves offers to tow Stephen's car and have the tires fixed.
I'll take care of it.
The Bishop even hands Stephen the keys to his own van to use at his convenience.
The Bishop gave him the keys because his tires were slashed. He's looking out for him.
See you soon.
But Reeves can't help being deeply concerned for his own safety as well as Stephen's. So he decides to take protective action.
Steve.
Mr. Reeves had an alarm system installed in the house.
He shows Stephen how to input a 4-digit code onto the number pad that will arm and disarm the system.
He gives Stephen the opportunity to put in a separate code. So Stephen has a code, and then the Bishop has his own separate code.
The Bishop hopes that this new measure will make Stephen feel more secure. But their peace of mind isn't destined to last. Late one day, Velma is returning from a friend's house when her cell phone rings.
The voice says, "I'm sorry about your tires."
Velma rushes to check her car.
She discovers that her own car tires have been slashed.
There were no other tires slashed in that area, so it looks like it was very isolated that she was picked out. They obviously knew what her activities were and scared her.
The idea of terrorizing somebody by telling them in advance what you're going to do to them is almost like torture.
Like Stephen, Velma has gotten several strange calls in recent weeks.
Who would do this?
Neither Velma nor Stephen have any idea where these messages are coming from.
I don't know what's going on. I don't even know what to do right now.
This has to be a moment where Velma is questioning these friends and these benefits. These benefits ain't so good right now.
A situation that started off aimed at Stephen is now spreading out to impact his friends. So Velma decides it's time to bring in the cops.
She shared that recording with the Durham Police Department to determine whether they could see whose voice it was.
By January 2008, Stephen's life is in a tailspin. On top of the recent stalking incident, now his financial worries have resurfaced.
Stephen didn't come from a whole lot of resources. He doesn't have much money.
Despite a job lead the bishop gave him in the fall, Stephen remains unemployed and financially strapped. And rent is due. The bishop is sympathetic to all Stephen is going through, but he still wants to be paid.
We're gonna have to talk about your rent.
The bishop asked Stephen, "So Stephen, how you gonna pay this rent? It's dirt cheap, but you don't have any money."
The bishop wants to help resolve the situation, but nothing will prepare Stephen for what the man of God will suggest as a solution.
So the bishop ended up talking to Stephen about whether Stephen had engaged in homosexual behavior. Bishop went on to describe how when two men are having sex, as long as you close your eyes, you don't really know who you're having sex with. Just put a pillow over your face and you won't really know the difference.
Putting yourself back in the mind of Stephen, his mind really has to be turning.
Before he can answer, the bishop offers to ease Stephen's financial burdens considerably in exchange for sexual favors.
He says, "Now suppose you and I engage in oral sex, because whether oral sex comes from a man or a woman, it's all the same, right, Stevie?" The bishop says, "Hey, if we can do these acts rent-free."
Stephen is shocked at the idea of prostituting himself to keep a roof over his head.
The bishop is supposed to be the man of God. And yet, now the bishop is pursuing him sexually. This is a man of the cloth acting this way?
It's exploitative. I know you have nowhere else to go. Stephen's gonna feel like his back is against the wall.
The bishop keeps talking, but Stephen has heard enough.
Can you take your hands off? Okay.
Stephen says, "I'm not going to take it there. I'm not interested in this kind of thing."
How about you think about it?
But the bottom line is that Stephen still doesn't have a job, and his bills aren't going to disappear anytime soon.
He's in a tough spot because he doesn't have any money. He doesn't really have a lot of alternatives.
Unwilling to go back to living in his car, Stephen grudgingly decides he'll have to keep his room with the bishop, even if it means putting up with uncomfortable come-ons. But uncertain how far the bishop will push him for sexual favors, he opts for some extra protection.
Stephen felt like he needed to be armed, and he went out and got a gun.
He hid it in his bedroom so that he would be able to feel safe in the house.
And there's no telling what else Stephen will do to protect himself. In January 2008, life is swerving out of control for 22-year-old college senior Stephen. He's juggling secret relationships with two beautiful young women, Velma and Latrice. His landlord, a pastor who calls himself the bishop, is taking advantage of Stephen's financial problems by promising free rent in exchange for sexual favors. And a mysterious stalker is threatening Stephen, Velma, and the bishop. On January 29th, Stephen looks to forget his worries with the one person unconnected to them, Latrice. They haven't made love since the fall, and believing she's separated from her husband, Stephen invites her over for a second session.
Latrice had told her husband that she was studying at the library at NC Central, that she was going to be a little bit late. But in fact, she was not at the library. She was with Stephen, and they were together at the bishop's home, and they had sex that night.
They're clearly hot for each other.
Lost in this moment of lust, Stephen feels he's left his problems far behind him until he realizes he may have just created a massive new one.
What are you looking for?
Stephen was using a condom, and during the course of intercourse, that condom apparently came off of him.
The mishap throws Stephen into a panic about his future.
Okay.
This basketball player with dreams and ambitions may have gotten this young woman pregnant.
Becoming a father is the last thing on Stephen's mind, but Latrice has a very different reaction.
She let Stephen know that she would like to take the relationship further.
Pregnant or not, she sees a future for her and Stephen.
It only takes that one time. We can be good friends, have great conversations, but then when you take that next step of sex, now that flood of emotions come. Whereas the guy maybe could take it or leave it and just another conquest. Now she's really head over heels.
Latrice is more interested in Stephen than she is her marriage, and she is sort of inquiring, where's this relationship going? Is she to tell her husband that it's over with?
But her lover doesn't share her enthusiasm.
Stephen is thinking, man, she wants to basically leave her husband altogether and be with me. This thing is heating up a little bit too fast.
Stephen's instincts tell him to run from his complicated relationship with Latrice.
He has a lot of stress on his plate. He needs to figure out what his next step is.
When Latrice leaves Stephen's place around 10 that evening, he turns to his longtime friend with benefits, Velma, for comfort.
Stephen and Velma were close as friends because they both understood where they were in their respective lives.
But he can't seem to forget what just happened with Latrice.
She's on the phone several times with Stephen, of course, not knowing that Stephen is back at his girlfriend Velma's house.
And Velma has no idea just how serious things with Stephen and Latrice have become. But whatever girlfriend dramas Stephen has going on in his life are nothing compared to the real tragedy ahead. The next morning, January 30th, the sun has not yet risen, but traffic is already backing up on I-540.
Passing motorists see something on the side of the road.
The commuter alerts authorities to an eerie sight on the roadside.
It was the kind of thing where you sort of view it from a distance and you think it probably can't be what it appears to be.
Upon their arrival, deputies spot what looks like an abandoned vehicle, but a harrowing sight greets them as they get closer.
They see this woman's body on the side of the road.
This person had been stabbed 30 times, all about the chest and almost decapitated, stabbed in the stomach, just horribly murdered.
Nobody knew how she got there or who she was.
Investigators seal off the area, and begin analyzing the crime scene, starting with the car.
There was blood around the door area of the driver's side, which indicates some sort of confrontation inside the car.
And the fact the body was dumped in such an exposed place gives police the impression the killer was disturbed.
And that's why she was left so close to the road where people could see her.
While most of the crime scene remains a mystery, one thing about the murder seems certain.
The number and the extent of the wounds did not show a random attack. This is a crime of passion.
Investigators have only just begun the process of identifying the victim when Darren, Latrice's husband, arrives at the scene. He's recognized the victim's car.
He pulled over and told him who he was and wanted to go up there.
However, as Darren approaches investigators, he catches sight of a body beneath a blue sheet.
That's not my wife.
And he's like, please don't tell me that's my wife under that tarp.
But when Darren shows them a picture, his worst fears are realized, as the identity of the victim is instantly confirmed: 21-year-old Latrice Curtis. As the victim's spouse, Darren is immediately under suspicion.
He's one of them, the suspects that they had in the beginning, and they questioned him extensively.
Darren would say he did get a call from her, and she said that she was on the way home from the library but was going to stop and get something to eat.
According to Darren, that call was at 10 p.m., but she never arrived.
When he woke up in the morning, he said she wasn't there, and he initially wasn't concerned, but then he started to make his way toward work, and that's when he saw the blue tarp on the side of 540.
Cops are puzzled why the husband wouldn't have called police first thing that morning. And with no witness to corroborate his story, Darren becomes the prime suspect in his wife's murder. The next day, the Wake County Sheriff's Office pores over Latrice's cell phone records to confirm Darren's story of the previous night.
They were available online along with his, and it showed Darren did get a call from her.
Now the police make a startling discovery.
He starts to go through the cell phone records to see who Latrice had talked to late the night before, and he sees this same number over and over.
The number isn't Darren's.
They began tracing that number.
As investigators race to identify the owner of the unknown cell phone, they have no idea he's about to walk through their doors first. It's the first day of February 2008, and investigators are hot on the trail of Latrice Curtis's murderer. 21-year-old Latrice was found stabbed to death on the side of the highway 2 days ago, and authorities think the key to solving the murder lies in her cell phone records.
There's a particular number that Latrice had been calling on that previous evening.
Hey, come look at this.
Investigators contact the service provider and learn the identity of the mysterious owner, a 22-year-old Durham College student named Stephen. But before they can find him, Stephen appears at the Wake County Sheriff's Office.
Stephen comes in unannounced and just says, I want to tell you what I know about this girl. Law enforcement doesn't often get something that's just sort of handed to them like that.
But he isn't alone.
The bishop accompanied Stephen to be there in case there was anything Stephen would need.
The bad feelings between Stephen and his preacher landlord appear to have been forgotten, and at this tragic moment, Stephen is grateful for his support.
He's a preacher. This is what preachers do.
Looks like we have time for you now, if you'd like to follow me.
While Stephen gives a statement, the bishop waits in the sheriff's office.
I understand you know Latrice Curtis.
Once in the interview room, detectives begin grilling Stephen about why Latrice was calling him the night she died.
Stephen began saying, I know this young lady. I was with her on the 29th. Stephen did not admit that he had been involved with Latrice romantically. He sort of gives a background, and we talked and we knew each other.
But detectives suspect there's more to the relationship. And after several hours, Stephen finally caves.
She was in my room.
I thought you were just friends.
He's kind of like, okay, let me tell you the truth. This is what was going on.
At a certain point, it comes out that Stephen
We had sex that night.
did have a sexual relationship with Latrice, and that he and Latrice, in fact, had sex on the very night that she was murdered, and is concerned that he may have gotten this young lady pregnant.
But Stephen says he has nothing to do with Latrice's murder. And what's more, he has an alibi.
Where did you go after Latrice left?
I went to V's house.
He was over at Velma's house, but Latrice and Stephen were trading phone calls for some period of time.
Hello?
Latrice is telling Stephen that she wants to take the relationship further. Stephen is not as heartfelt about it.
I'm just not sure about right now.
The condom incident appears to give Stephen a good reason to want Latrice out of his life. But could it have given him a motive to kill? Stephen claims he spoke with Latrice one more time while at Velma's house around 11.
And that was the last that he had talked to her.
He hangs out over there pretty late, like 1:30. And from there he comes back to his place, back to the bishop's place.
But a new piece of evidence is about to cast serious doubt over his version of events. While Stephen is being questioned, a state trooper who is on Highway 540 the night of the murder arrives at the sheriff's office.
I explained how I was on 540 at 1:30 on January 30th. Ran into a vehicle on the shoulder of the road with its flashers on. The door was unlocked. You could hear the chime of the keys in the ignition. And I got kind of a weird feeling at that point because it was unusual. Something just didn't feel right. I ran the tag on the vehicle to make sure it wasn't stolen.
Even stranger, it doesn't appear to be the only disabled vehicle on this stretch of the highway.
I did notice another car on the other side of the highway. And I was thinking that, hey, once I'm done with here, I'll go over there and check on that car.
The trooper is called away on another job before he can look. However, he logs in the license plate number. And later, the tag request yields a fateful piece of information.
When the communications center came back to me, they told me it was a 2004 Chrysler Pacifica out of Durham, registered to a Robert Reeves.
At that moment, the bishop is in the sheriff's office, so detectives bring him in to explain why his vehicle was spotted near a murder scene.
Please follow me.
So where were you the night of the 29th, Mr. Reeves?
He said, I don't know anything about that. I went to the church last night, and that I came home around 11:30.
But Reeves does have a theory as to why his car was there that night. And when he shares it, it will set investigators on the direct path to Latrice Curtis's brutal killer. Investigators are on the verge of discovering who killed 21-year-old college student Latrice Curtis on the shoulder of a North Carolina highway.
They know that a van registered to Robert Reeves was across the road about the time she was murdered.
The bishop claims he was at church on the night of the murder, but he admits it's possible that his vehicle was at the scene, with someone else driving it.
Does anyone have access to your vehicle, Mr. Reeves?
My tenant, Stephen.
He says Stephen had access to my car.
Stephen was trying to get some work done to his car, and so he was borrowing the bishop's van a little bit.
The facts are beginning to stack up against Stephen. His alibi is that he was with Velma, his longtime friend with benefits. So cops contact her for a statement.
Stephen's whereabouts that night were accounted for by Velma. He was at Velma's house until sometime right before 1:30.
Investigators' attention shifts to Velma. Could she have found out about Latrice's possible pregnancy and flown into a jealous rage? But Velma is innocent and shares a threatening voicemail with investigators to show she's a victim as well.
Velma said that she did not recognize the voice on the other end of the line.
Velma shared the recording with Durham police when her tires were slashed, but they have yet to track down the caller. Now eager for possible leads in Latrice's murder, Wake County deputies are interested in finding him as well.
They at that time received a copy of the recording from Velma that she had kept.
Police take the recording to Stephen to see if there might be a link.
Does this sound like it could be him?
I'm disheartened by what happened to your car.
They play that back for Stephen. And immediately Stephen says, "That's the bishop."
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure that's him.
That was a complete shock. He didn't know that the bishop had been making those phone calls.
Although investigators can't be 100% certain the voice on the message is the bishop's, a detailed analysis of phone records does tie him to the calls directed at Stephen. Although on those, he kept his identity hidden or roped in strangers to call under the pretense of a joke.
The bishop actually had several cell phones, and one of them we called a fun phone because it was the one that he would use for homosexual behavior.
The bishop's crank calls are deeply incriminating, so police start looking more closely at the man of the cloth.
There was a conviction for a sexual offense in South Carolina involving a 17-year-old boy, and then he'd also been charged once, but not convicted for another sex crime.
There were other sexual advances that were reported but never charged.
Police check the bishop's alibi that he was at church, but it doesn't hold water.
Somebody at that church would have seen this man, but nobody saw him.
The crank phone calls, Reeves' sinister past, and his inability to explain the presence of his vehicle at a murder scene provide cops with enough evidence to arrest Reeves. Velma is never a suspect in Latrice's murder. Both Stephen and Latrice's husband, Darren, are quickly eliminated as suspects. On September 5th, 2009, Robert Reeves stands trial for the murder of Latrice Curtis. The prosecution believes Latrice's fate was sealed back when Stephen moved in with the bishop.
He was exploiting his status as a minister and bringing Stephen into his home so that he could get closer to him.
He tried to convince Stephen that you could do certain things. You could get rent free here in exchange for sexual favors.
When Stephen turned him down, the bishop began taking out his frustrations on the women in Stephen's life. The prosecution maintains that on the night of January 29th, 2008, after seeing Latrice leaving Stephen's basement room, the bishop snapped once and for all.
He sees Latrice Curtis as the person that's keeping Stephen away from him. As a predator, he's gonna do whatever he has to do to get to who he wants.
He begins to follow her and follows her over into Wake County.
Latrice's cell phone records show she speaks to her husband Darren around 10 and trades several phone calls with Stephen before 11. And they believe sometime after that, Reeves gets her attention.
They met each other on the shoulder of 540 eastbound where Robert Reeves' vehicle was left.
Is it all right if we talk? Is it all right if I come inside and talk?
Recognizing the bishop, Latrice agrees, and the two drive around for a while, eventually pulling over at a shoulder across the highway from where Reeves left his car.
They stopped on the side of 540 westbound. At that point, Something obviously set him off.
Blind with sexual jealousy, Reeves pulls a knife and slits Latrice's throat. The wound is so deep, it nearly severs her vocal cords. But that doesn't begin to satisfy Reeves' raging bloodlust.
He got out and dragged her out of the vehicle onto the shoulder of the road where he stabbed her 30-plus times.
Once Reeves is finished, he hauls Latrice's body towards the woods to hide it. But the flashing lights of the state trooper checking his car on the other side of the highway scare him.
He dropped her on the side of the road and ran. And that's why she was left so close to the road where people could see her.
Once the trooper is gone, Reeves returns to his car and drives home, not realizing that his license plate number has now been logged into the police database. But what really seals Reeves' fate is DNA evidence linking him directly to the crime scene.
When Latrice's car was examined, a swab was taken from her steering wheel.
Lab tests confirmed the likelihood the DNA belongs to the bishop. On October 9th, 2009, 43-year-old Robert Reeves is found guilty of the murder of Latrice Curtis.
Normally, we think about another woman getting so enraged on another woman. But in this situation, it was a case of a man who was so intent on having another man that he just took this person's life because he wanted what he wanted when he wanted it.
Remember Latrice smiling, having fun? That's how I remember. I remember, that's why I tell you when I lay down, I think about all the good things, you know? The biggest question would be, why? Why did you go to this extreme? Because look, I'm trying to tell you, this man killed my daughter.
There is a specific kind of sanctuary found only in the dimly lit, unassuming corners of working-class America. It is not a place built of marble or stained glass, but rather of scuffed linoleum, worn wooden stools, and the soft, steady hum of neon signs buzzing against the night window. In Long Beach, California, during the sprawling and transitional decade of the 1980s, this sanctuary took the form of local dive bars. These were establishments where the grueling weight of manual labor, the exhaustion of the daily grind, and the relentless pressure of making ends meet could be temporarily left on the pavement outside. The Wander Bar was exactly this kind of refuge. Nestled into the urban fabric of a city defined by its shipyards, its sprawling ports, and its blue-collar heartbeat, the Wander Inn was more than just a business. It was a communal living room for those who needed a cheap drink and a familiar face. It was a place where names were known, where the problems of the outside world were drowned out by the clinking of heavy glass mugs, and where the most pressing issue of the evening was usually nothing more than the score of a televised game. The date was October the 6th, 1986. It was a Monday. In the cultural rhythm of the United States, a Monday night in the middle of autumn means one very specific thing: Monday Night Football. This is a weekly ritual that transcends mere sports, acting as a gathering force that pulls tired people out of their homes and into the shared glow of a television screen. The atmosphere inside the Wander Bar that night was thick with camaraderie and the casual, easy energy of a crowd unwinding. The space was packed, a crowded room filled with the low rumble of overlapping conversations, sudden bursts of laughter, the smell of spilled beer, and the sharp, distinctive scent of cigarette smoke hanging in the air like a thin curtain. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder at the long wooden counter. Among them were groups of friends, solitary regulars seeking quiet company, and couples like Bruce Monroe and his wife, alongside siblings like the Whidden twins, Melvin and Kelvin. They were all completely absorbed in the safety of their routine, their attention tethered to the brightly lit screen broadcasting the football game, entirely unaware that the invisible boundary separating their safe haven from the brutal unpredictability of the outside world was about to shatter completely. To understand the sheer magnitude of the violence that was about to unfold and the profound legal earthquake it would trigger in the decades to follow, one must look away from the warm glow of the television screen and turn toward the cold darkness waiting just outside the doors of the Wanderin. In the shadows of that October night stood a man whose entire existence seemed to be a sequence of profound disconnects and silent, mounting frustrations. His name was Paul Palaloa Tuilaipa. Born in 1965 in the distant island territory of Samoa, Tuilaipa's life was uprooted before he could even begin to formulate a sense of identity. At the fragile age of 5, he was brought across the Pacific Ocean to the United States, thrust into a complex, fast-paced society that demanded assimilation. But for Tuilaipa, assimilation never came. Instead, his life became a profound study in isolation. Forensic psychology and judicial records would later paint a deeply troubling portrait of the man standing outside the bar. Tuilaipa was not a criminal mastermind executing a highly sophisticated syndicate operation. He was a man severely hindered by profound cognitive deficits. His intelligence quotient was categorized as remarkably low, placing him firmly within the spectrum of intellectual disability. Furthermore, despite having lived in the United States for nearly 2 decades by that fateful night in 1986, he suffered from a paralyzing language barrier. He could not speak English with any degree of fluency, nor had he retained a functional grasp of his native Samoan. He was a man trapped in a silent void, unable to communicate his needs, his thoughts, or his frustrations to the world around him. This profound inability to connect, combined with his severe cognitive limitations, created a volatile internal landscape. In the absence of language, in the absence of intellectual reasoning, Tuilaipa's primary mechanism for interacting with a world he could not comprehend was a terrifying propensity for sudden, impulsive, and catastrophic violence. There is a chilling juxtaposition between the two realities existing at this exact moment in time on October the 6th. Inside the Wanderin, there is the warmth of human connection, the predictable rhythm of a sporting event, and the foundational belief that one is safe within a crowd of peers. Outside, there is Tuilaipa, a man utterly alienated from the human experience, armed and operating on the rawest, most dangerous frequencies of impulse. He was not alone. He was accompanied by an accomplice, another shadow in the long beach night. The preparation they undertook was both rudimentary and deeply sinister. They were dressed in unremarkable, utilitarian khaki clothing, designed to blend into the industrial backdrop of the city. But it was what they wore on their heads that signaled the calculated, predatory nature of their intent. Both men wore tight hairnets. In an era where forensic science was rapidly advancing, the use of hairnets was a chillingly deliberate measure to prevent a single strand of DNA from falling onto the crime scene. It was a detail that highlighted a terrifying contradiction: a man with profound intellectual disabilities executing a homegrown robbery with the cold, physical premeditation of an apex predator. Hidden beneath the long, heavy fabric of the accomplice's coat was a handgun. But Tuilaipa himself carried something far more devastating, a weapon completely incongruous with the confined, populated space of a local tavern. He gripped a .22 caliber rifle. It is a weapon designed for distance for the outdoors for hunting. In the close, claustrophobic quarters of a crowded dive bar, a .22 caliber rifle is not just a tool for intimidation. It is an instrument of absolute, uncontrollable carnage. The very presence of such a long-barreled weapon in a space filled with wooden stools, glass bottles, and tightly packed bodies meant that any discharge would be catastrophic. The rifle was not merely brought along as a threat, it was brought with a horrifying readiness to be used. The story of what happened next is not simply a recounting of a robbery gone terribly, tragically wrong. It is a narrative about the absolute fragility of human life and the terrifying speed at which the mundane can be entirely swallowed by the macabre. The patrons of the Wanderin were living their final seconds of normalcy. The bartender, Lee Malmstrom, was wiping down the glass cabinets, his back turned to the heavy entrance doors, his mind likely drifting toward the end of his shift and the routine task of closing the register. Melvin and Kelvin Whidden were likely exchanging comments about the football game, their twin bond anchoring them in a shared moment of relaxation. Bruce Monroe and his wife were simply existing in the comforting presence of one another. None of them could possibly fathom that their lives, their bodies, and their futures were about to intersect with the explosive, unarticulated rage of a man who had slipped entirely through the cracks of society. Furthermore, this night at the Wander Inn Bar is not merely a contained tragedy from the late 1980s. The violence that was about to erupt would act as the catalyst for one of the most significant, protracted, and grueling legal battles in the modern history of American jurisprudence. The blood spilled on the linoleum floor of this Long Beach tavern would eventually pool at the very steps of the United States Supreme Court. For nearly 4 decades, the actions taken in these impending, chaotic seconds would force the highest legal minds in the country to grapple with the darkest, most complex corners of the Constitution. The case of Tuilaepa versus California would become a monumental legal precedent, forcing society to ask excruciatingly difficult questions about justice, retribution, and the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. How does a civilized society weigh the immeasurable, agonizing loss of innocent life against the undeniable cognitive reality of a perpetrator who lacks the mental capacity of a fully functioning adult? When the ultimate penalty of death is placed on the scales, how does the law account for a man damaged by a lifetime of silent alienation, yet capable of inflicting such calculated, irreversible horror? These are the profound, agonizing questions that will echo through the decades, from 1986 through the landmark Supreme Court decision in 1994, all the way to the relentless clemency appeals of 2025. But before the gavels fall, before the constitutional scholars debate the agonizing nuances of capital punishment, and before the heavy, indelible scars are permanently etched onto the survivors, there is only this single, suspended moment in time. The clock ticks toward the late hours of the night. The football game flickers on the screen, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the weary working class. The air inside the Wander Inn is warm, heavy, and completely undisturbed. Outside, hands wrapped tightly around the cold, unyielding steel of a .22 caliber rifle, Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa takes a breath. The heavy wooden door of the tavern stands as the only remaining barrier between the quiet sanctuary of the innocent and the impending, devastating roar of a massacre. And then, without a word, the door is pushed open. Long Beach in the autumn of 1986 was a sprawling municipality firmly anchored by the relentless, grinding rhythm of manual labor. It was a city characterized by its massive, echoing shipyards, the towering cranes of the commercial ports, and the countless individuals who traded their physical strength and their time for a modest paycheck. In this specific socioeconomic climate, the local dive bar served a function far more vital and complex than simply functioning as a commercial establishment that dispensed alcohol. Places like the Wander Inn Bar were essential social infrastructures. They functioned as secular, blue-collar sanctuaries for the working class. When patrons pushed their way through the heavy, battered wooden doors of the Wander Inn, they were not just seeking a cheap beer. They were actively seeking a temporary reprieve from the crushing, invisible weight of their economic realities and societal pressures. The bar was a deliberately enclosed universe, a dimly lit space where the harsh, unforgiving judgments of the outside world were entirely suspended. The ambient, comforting noise of clinking heavy glass mugs, the low, steady murmur of familiar, trusted voices, and the flickering, hypnotic, almost sacred light of the television broadcasting Monday Night Football created a collective, psychological shield against the crushing isolation of modern American life. Inside these walls, individuals were not defined by their subordinate job titles, their mounting debts, or their personal struggles. They were defined solely by their presence and their participation in the community. It was a space built upon the unspoken, foundational agreement that everyone inside was simply trying to survive the week, and that shared, quiet struggle forged a silent but profoundly powerful bond among the patrons sitting shoulder to shoulder. At the very center of this delicate, carefully maintained ecosystem stood Lee Malmstrom, the bartender on duty that fateful Monday night. In a working-class establishment like the Wander Inn, the bartender is never relegated to being just a faceless service worker. They're the custodian of the sanctuary, the orchestrator of the room's atmosphere, and very often, the quiet, non-judgmental confidant for a room full of weary, hardened souls. Malmstrom's exact physical position in the bar during the moments leading up to the attack is a detail of profound narrative and tragic significance. He was positioned securely behind the long, polished wooden counter, fundamentally responsible for the flow and the safety of the evening. The provided judicial case files note precisely what Malmstrom was doing in the fragile seconds before the violence erupted. He was standing with his back completely turned to the main entrance, his attention entirely absorbed in the mundane, repetitive, and deeply domestic task of wiping down the glass cabinets behind the bar. This simple action, cleaning glass in the dim, artificial light of a busy tavern, perfectly encapsulates the absolute, terrifying absence of any perceived threat. Malmstrom was completely in his element, operating within a space he likely knew as intimately as the layout of his own living room. He was surrounded by regular customers whose faces he recognized, protected by the heavy physical barrier of the counter, and lulled into a state of complete psychological vulnerability by the predictable, comforting hum of the Monday night crowd. His turned back represents the ultimate, tragic innocence of the scene. It is a physical manifestation of the deep trust that the patrons and the staff placed in the unwritten social contract of the Wander Inn. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were safe. Malmstrom's absolute focus on the glass cabinets meant he would have zero visual or auditory warning of the nightmare about to cross the threshold, making his sudden, violent transition from peaceful, working routine to absolute, paralyzing terror, one of the most jarring and horrific elements of the impending crime. Seated closely together toward the right side of the wooden counter were Melvin and Kelvin Whitten, two brothers whose presence in the bar that night adds a layer of profound, devastating tragedy to the overall narrative. They were twins, a biological and psychological reality that fundamentally alters how their actions and reactions must be understood within the context of this horrific event. To be a twin is to share a bond that precedes conscious memory, a genetic and emotional connection rooted in the very beginning of human existence. It is a complex relationship almost always characterized by an intense, unspoken, and fiercely defensive loyalty, alongside an instinctual, almost cellular drive to protect the other half of one's own identity. Sitting side by side on the worn bar stools, Melvin and Kelvin were likely entirely relaxed, their attention drifting comfortably between the glowing broadcast of the football game on the television and the casual, effortless conversation that flows only between siblings who have spent a lifetime in each other's constant company. They were occupying their rightful space in the world, enjoying the simple, fundamental liberty of a peaceful evening out. When analyzing the subsequent, rapid-fire events documented in the court records, it is absolutely crucial to understand the deep psychological foundation of Melvin and Kelvin's relationship. The case files clearly indicate that when the lethal threat finally presented itself, Melvin did not freeze in panic, nor did he simply comply with the aggressive demands of the armed assailants. Instead, he made a split-second, incredibly brave decision to actively resist. He chose to turn on his stool, bridge the distance, and physically engage the immediate threat by tackling the accomplice directly to the hard floor. This was not the calculated, tactical move of a highly trained combatant. It was the raw, unfiltered, and desperate manifestation of deep protective instinct. Melvin's tragic, heroic action was likely fueled, at least in significant part, by the immediate, visceral need to neutralize a deadly threat that was standing mere feet away from his twin brother. The physical presence of Kelvin transformed Melvin from a passive, compliant victim into an active, aggressive defender. It was a fateful decision rooted in the deepest, most admirable of human connections, but it was a decision that would ultimately and unfairly cost him his life in the most brutal, unforgiving manner imaginable. Scattered throughout the rest of the dimly lit, smoke-filled room were other individuals whose lives, bodies, and sense of security were about to be permanently shattered by the impending, senseless violence. Among them was Bruce Monroe, sitting quietly in a booth or at a table with his wife. Like the Wooden twins at the counter, the Monroes represent the fundamental, beautiful human connections that were violently intruded upon and desecrated that night. They were a married couple, sharing a dedicated space of mutual comfort, quiet intimacy, and domestic normalcy within the larger, bustling crowd. For Bruce Monroe, the sudden, explosive introduction of lethal violence into this safe space would immediately trigger an ancient, deeply ingrained psychological imperative, the absolute, non-negotiable necessity to shield his spouse from physical harm. The horrific trajectory of the night would force Monroe to transform instantly from a relaxed, off-duty patron into a literal human shield. Not far from the Monroes stood Kenneth Boone, another patron whose terrifying experience that night highlights the absolute, paralyzing randomness of the tragedy. Boone was merely a bystander, a man simply existing in the shared, communal space of the tavern. Unlike Melvin Whidden, who actively and physically engaged the attackers, or Bruce Monroe, who threw his own body into the direct line of fire to protect a loved one, Boone represents the paralyzing, incomprehensible shock of the situation. The official court records indicate that when the violence reached its absolute, deafening peak, Boone stood absolutely motionless, frozen in place by a sudden tidal wave of sheer terror that completely overrode every rational cognitive function and survival instinct. He was unable to fight back, unable to flee for the exits, and left entirely at the mercy of a chaotic, violent situation over which he had absolutely no control. Boone's presence serves as a grim, unsettling reminder that in moments of sudden, catastrophic violence, survival is rarely a matter of deliberate choice or heroic action. It is far too often dictated entirely by the arbitrary, chaotic whims of the armed perpetrators. As the clock ticked relentlessly closer to the precise moment of the violent breach, the Wander Inn bar existed in a fragile, suspended, and entirely temporary state of grace. Every single individual in that room, Lee Malmstrom with his cleaning cloth and the spotless glass, Melvin and Kelvin Whidden sharing their comfortable, brotherly silence, Bruce Monroe sitting protectively beside his wife, and Kenneth Boone lost in his own quiet thoughts, was entirely defined by their inherent humanity, their personal connections, and their quiet, everyday dignities. They were a collection of intersecting lives, complex, deeply rooted, and completely, tragically unaware that their shared sanctuary was about to be violated in the most grotesque, unforgiving manner possible. The air inside the tavern was thick with a familiar, comforting smell of stale beer, the steady, electronic sound of the sports broadcast, and the easy, relaxed rhythm of a Monday night slowly winding down toward closing time. There was absolutely nothing in the atmosphere, no shift in the temperature, no subtle warning sign, to suggest that just outside the walls, in the cold, uncaring darkness of the Long Beach night, Paul Palaloa Tuiloepa was raising his long, .22 caliber rifle. His mind was entirely devoid of empathy, his face hidden beneath a sterile hairnet, his finger resting heavily on the cold steel of the trigger, preparing to shatter their world forever. The heavy, battered wooden doors of the Wander Inn bar did not simply open. They were violently breached, severing the fragile sanctuary of the tavern from the dark reality of the Long Beach night. The transition from the mundane, comforting atmosphere of a Monday evening to a state of absolute, unfiltered terror occurred in a mere fraction of a second, moving far too rapidly for the human brain to process. The patrons, lulled into a false sense of security by the hypnotic glow of the television broadcasting the football game and the steady murmur of familiar voices, were suddenly thrust into a waking nightmare. Two figures materialized from the shadows of the street, stepping aggressively into the dimly lit, smoke-filled room. Their appearance was deeply jarring, a calculated visual assault designed to intimidate and disorient. They were not dressed as patrons seeking a drink, nor did they bear the casual demeanor of ordinary men. Both intruders were uniformly clad in heavy, utilitarian khaki clothing, a deliberate choice that stripped them of any distinguishing personal characteristics and allowed them to blend into the industrial grimness of the city. But the most chilling visual detail, the element that instantly signaled the cold, premeditated nature of their intent, rested upon their heads. Both men wore tight, sterile hairnets. In an environment defined by the casual disarray of the working class, the presence of hairnets was profoundly unnatural. It was a stark, terrifying indicator that these men were acutely aware of forensic science, purposefully obscuring their identities and meticulously ensuring that not a single strand of DNA would be left behind on the tavern floor. The man leading this terrifying intrusion was Paul Palaloa Tuilaipa. He did not issue a warning, nor did he hesitate to establish his absolute dominance over the room. His presence was immediately anchored by the devastating weapon he wielded. Tuilaipa tightly gripped a .22 caliber rifle, a long-barreled instrument of death that looked grotesquely out of place within the confined, heavily populated walls of the dive bar. The dark steel of the barrel absorbed the neon light, projecting a silent, lethal promise to everyone in its trajectory. Beside him, operating with a synchronized, predatory silence, was his unidentified accomplice. While Tuilaipa brandished the rifle openly, demanding immediate submission, the accomplice concealed a handgun beneath the heavy folds of a long coat, a hidden secondary threat ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. The sudden, violent insertion of these high-powered firearms into a space filled with fragile human bodies immediately vacuumed all the breathable air out of the room, replacing the smell of stale beer with the sharp, metallic anticipation of bloodshed. Behind the long wooden counter, Lee Malmstrom was entirely consumed by the most ordinary of tasks. His back was turned completely toward the entrance, his hands moving in a rhythmic, practiced motion as he wiped down the glass cabinets. He was insulated by the familiar, comforting noise of the crowd, completely blind to the catastrophic shift in the room's atmosphere. The first indication Malmstrom had that his world was actively collapsing was a sudden, guttural shout that tore through the ambient noise of the tavern. It was a sound entirely devoid of humanity, a raw, violent bark of command that shattered the comfortable illusion of safety. Instinctively reacting to the sheer volume and aggression of the noise, Malmstrom ceased his cleaning and spun around on his heels. As his vision focused on the space in front of his counter, he did not see a thirsty patron or a familiar regular. Instead, his eyes were immediately drawn to the cold, unforgiving abyss of a .22 caliber rifle barrel. Tuilaipa had crossed the room with terrifying speed, closing the distance between the door and the bar in seconds. The rifle was thrust aggressively over the wooden counter, the muzzle hovering mere inches from Malmstrom's face. The physical proximity of the weapon was paralyzing, forcing Malmstrom to stare directly into the mechanical mechanism that could instantly end his life. Tuilaipa leaned over the counter, his face obscured, his eyes burning with an unarticulated, volatile rage, and roared his demand. The words were simple, driven by a primal greed, commanding the bartender to surrender every single dollar hidden within the establishment. Under the overwhelming, immediate threat of execution, the concept of resistance evaporates, replaced entirely by the desperate biological imperative to survive the next few seconds. Malmstrom did not argue, nor did he hesitate. Operating under a state of profound shock, his body moving on sheer autonomic compliance, he immediately turned toward the establishment's safe. He pulled the heavy metal cash tray entirely out of its secure housing and lifted it up, placing it directly onto the polished wooden surface of the bar. The tray was full of the night's earnings, a physical manifestation of the patron's hard labor. Tuilaipa and his hidden accomplice did not waste a single motion. They lunged toward the counter, their hands moving with frantic, greedy desperation, grabbing thick handfuls of paper currency and violently shoving the cash deep into the pockets of their khaki clothing. In a standard robbery, the acquisition of the main cash register usually signals the end of the ordeal, the moment when the perpetrators flee to secure their stolen wealth. However, the tragedy of the Wander and Bar was just beginning to unfold. Driven by an insatiable, escalating greed and emboldened by the terrified submission of the crowd, Tuilaepa and his accomplice did not turn toward the exit. Instead, they made a calculated, devastating decision to systemically pillage the vulnerable patrons sitting helplessly throughout the room. The two armed men separated, splitting the room into two distinct zones of terror. Tuilaepa, his finger resting menacingly on the trigger of the long rifle, moved aggressively down the left side of the room. He moved from table to table, a silent harbinger of violence, physically looming over the terrified customers. With brutal efficiency, he targeted 3 separate men, forcefully snatching their leather wallets directly from their trembling hands or pulling them aggressively from their pockets, leaving a trail of profound psychological trauma in his wake. Simultaneously, the accomplice moved methodically down the right side of the wooden bar, his hand firmly grasping the concealed handgun beneath his long coat. The patrons on this side of the room were frozen, their eyes locked on the unfolding nightmare. As the accomplice advanced, he directly closed the physical distance between himself and the 2 brothers seated near the edge of the counter, Melvin and Kelvin Whidden. The twins were sitting on their wooden stools, their relaxed posture completely shattered by the invasion. The accomplice, perhaps sensing an opportunity to assert dominance over the physically capable men, targeted Melvin first. He approached Melvin from behind, shattering the remaining boundaries of personal space, and aggressively shoved him forward. The physical contact was jarring, an arrogant display of power accompanied by a sharp, violent demand for Melvin to immediately surrender his wallet. This single, physical push became the catastrophic catalyst for the carnage that followed. In the face of overwhelming, armed aggression, human beings typically default to a state of freezing or complete compliance. But Melvin Whidden, driven by a complex internal architecture of deeply rooted protective instincts and sheer, unfiltered courage, rejected submission. Knowing his twin brother was sitting merely inches away, completely exposed to the lethal threat of a concealed handgun, Melvin made a split-second decision that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the night. He did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he utilized the rotational momentum of the aggressive shove to pivot violently on his wooden bar stool. In a singular motion fueled by desperate adrenaline, Melvin launched his entire body weight forward, bridging the small gap and physically colliding with the armed accomplice. The sheer suddenness of the counterattack caught the perpetrator entirely off guard. Melvin tackled the man with devastating force, driving him violently downward until both men crashed onto the hard linoleum floor of the tavern. As they hit the ground, Melvin did not relent. He immediately engaged in a desperate, physical struggle for survival, throwing heavy, frantic punches at the accomplice, fighting with everything he had to neutralize the threat and protect the fragile sanctuary of his brother. The sounds of the struggle, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, and the violent scuffle of the fight echoed sharply through the room. On the opposite side of the establishment, Tuilaepa heard the commotion and immediately ceased his pillaging. He turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the chaotic scene unfolding near the right side of the bar. Seeing his accomplice pinned to the ground and actively taking damage from a patron, something deeply volatile and irreparably broken snapped within Tuilaepa's mind. The thin, fragile veneer of a robbery instantly dissolved, replaced entirely by a cold, uncontrollable urge to exterminate. He did not shout a warning, nor did he demand that Melvin step away. He simply began to walk. Tuilaepa advanced toward the struggle with terrifying, deliberate purpose. He did not raise the long barrel of the .22 caliber rifle to his shoulder to aim down the sights. Instead, displaying a chilling familiarity with the weapon and a complete disregard for human life, he held the rifle tight against his side, parallel to his waist, adopting a classic, devastating hip-firing posture. As Tuilaepa closed the distance, he leveled the muzzle directly at the desperate struggle on the floor. Without a fraction of a second of hesitation, without any flicker of human empathy or moral restraint, his finger pulled the cold steel trigger. The first shot erupted with a deafening, concussive crack that seemed to tear the very fabric of the room apart. The .22 caliber projectile tore through the smoky air at a terrifying velocity and struck Melvin Whidden directly in the neck at point-blank range. The devastating kinetic energy of the bullet instantly severed vital arteries and shattered the biological infrastructure required to sustain life. Melvin's desperate struggles ceased immediately. His body went limp, collapsing heavily onto the floor he had just fought so valiantly to defend, a rapidly expanding pool of dark blood pooling beneath him on the linoleum. He died instantly, sacrificing his own existence in a desperate, heroic bid to save those around him. The execution of Melvin completely shattered whatever paralyzed silence remained in the room, plunging the tavern into absolute, screaming chaos. Kelvin Whiddon, having just witnessed the brutal, instantaneous slaughter of his twin brother right before his eyes, was propelled by a surge of sheer, animalistic terror. Knowing he was entirely exposed to the lethal arc of the rifle, Kelvin threw himself frantically toward the floor, desperately scrambling for any available cover. He lunged behind a thick, structural wooden pillar that supported the ceiling of the bar, praying the solid mass would shield his fragile body. But Tuilaepa was operating in a state of absolute, mechanical violence. Tracking Kelvin's desperate movement, Tuilaepa seamlessly pivoted his hips, adjusting the aim of the rifle. He pulled the trigger a second time. The bullet carved a lethal path across the room, bypassing the wooden barrier, and struck Kelvin with devastating force, tearing directly through his chest cavity. Kelvin collapsed behind the pillar, critically wounded, gasping for air as his lungs filled with blood, completely incapacitated by the horrific injury. The violence did not pause to allow the survivors to process the unfolding tragedy. Tuilaepa, his eyes wild and unseeing, continued to sweep the muzzle of the smoking rifle across the room, searching for movement. His gaze locked onto a woman screaming in pure, unadulterated panic. As he menacingly aimed the barrel toward her trembling form, her husband, Bruce Monroe, recognized the immediate, lethal danger. In an act of profound, selfless love that directly mirrored Melvin's earlier sacrifice, Bruce did not run. Instead, he forcefully pushed himself into the open space, throwing his own body directly into the line of fire, transforming himself into a physical shield to absorb the impending violence meant for his wife. Tuilaepa's finger tightened on the trigger for the third time. The rifle barked again, sending a projectile directly into Bruce Monroe's stomach. The impact folded him in half, the agonizing pain radiating through his entire nervous system as he collapsed to the floor, succeeding in protecting his wife, but absorbing a massive, life-threatening trauma in the process. Having emptied the cash register, robbed the patrons, and left a trail of shattered, bleeding bodies across the floor of the tavern, Tuilaepa and his accomplice finally turned to flee. They rushed desperately toward the rear exit, seeking the dark anonymity of the alleyway. But even their escape would not be completely devoid of bloodshed. Standing completely paralyzed near the back door was Kenneth Boone. Boone had not fought back like Melvin, nor had he attempted to flee or hide. He was trapped in a state of profound physiological shock, entirely frozen, his mind unable to process the sheer volume of violence he had just witnessed. As Tuilaepa and his accomplice sprinted toward the door, they found their path partially blocked by the motionless patron. Tuilaepa did not push Boone aside or demand that he move. Instead, with a horrifying, casual indifference to the value of human life, Tuilaepa slowed his pace for just a fraction of a second. He raised the barrel of the .22 caliber rifle one final time, aiming it directly at the terrified, unmoving man. With a chilling, mechanical coldness, Tuilaepa pulled the trigger, firing a final, devastating shot directly into Kenneth Boone's neck. As Boone crumpled to the floor, joining the horrifying tableau of the wounded and the dying, Tuilaepa pushed open the heavy back door and vanished into the cold, silent darkness of the Long Beach night, leaving behind a shattered sanctuary that would never be the same. The silence that descends upon a confined space immediately following an explosion of extreme, concussive violence is never truly silent. It is a heavy, suffocating vacuum, aggressively filled with the ringing aftermath of gunfire and the unimaginable auditory reality of human suffering. Inside the Wanderin bar, the frantic, predatory energy of the two perpetrators had completely vanished, sucked out into the cold Long Beach night through the rear exit. In their devastating wake, they left a fractured reality. The comforting, blue-collar sanctuary that had existed just moments prior had been completely erased. The television, still silently broadcasting the mundane reality of a Monday night football game, cast a flickering, indifferent light over a room that had been fundamentally reorganized by terror. The dense, familiar smell of spilled beer and cigarette smoke had been entirely overpowered by the sharp, metallic, and acrid stench of discharged cordite from the .22 caliber rifle. This chemical odor hung thickly in the air, a chemical signature of the devastation that had just ripped through the establishment. On the linoleum floor, amidst the overturned wooden stools and shattered glass, the catastrophic physical toll of Paul Palaloa Tuilaipa's unprovoked rage was agonizingly apparent. When the first sirens began to wail in the distance, tearing through the ambient noise of the industrial city, they signaled the beginning of a desperate transition from an active massacre to a frantic medical and investigative triage. Law enforcement officers, including Officer Pavak of the Long Beach Police Department, arrived to secure the premises. Pushing through the heavy wooden doors, Pavak and his colleagues were instantly confronted with a visual manifestation of absolute chaos. Official reports would later struggle to encapsulate the sheer magnitude of the destruction, describing the interior of the tavern as closely resembling a chaotic slaughterhouse. The physical environment was completely decimated. Heavy wooden tables had been violently overturned during the frantic scramble for cover. Countless glass mugs and bottles had been shattered, scattering sharp, jagged fragments across the floor. These shards of glass were heavily coated in the copious amounts of blood that now pooled aggressively across the linoleum, creating a slick, hazardous environment for the responding medical personnel. The room was a testament to the indiscriminate, highly destructive nature of a high-powered firearm discharged in a closely confined, heavily populated space. The immediate priority of the responding units shifted entirely from law enforcement to desperate, rapid medical intervention. The human cost scattered across the floor of the Wander Inn was staggering. The most tragic and final assessment belonged to Melvin Whidden. The horrific proximity and trajectory of the first shot fired by Tuilaoipa had caused catastrophic, irreversible damage. The small but incredibly fast .22 caliber projectile had completely severed Melvin's vital neck arteries, leading to a massive and instantaneous exsanguination. Medical personnel could do absolutely nothing. His life had ended on the floor he had so bravely tried to defend, a permanent testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of the attack. For the remaining 3 victims, the fight for survival was a chaotic, agonizing blur of emergency trauma care. Kelvin Whidden, having watched his twin brother die before his eyes, was battling a devastating chest wound, his lungs struggling to process oxygen as his chest cavity filled with fluid. Bruce Monroe lay in excruciating agony, his abdominal region severely compromised by the bullet he had intentionally absorbed to shield his wife from execution. Near the rear exit, Kenneth Boone was bleeding profusely from a severe neck wound, the completely unprovoked parting shot from the fleeing gunman having narrowly missed severing his own vital lifelines. Through a combination of rapid emergency response times, immediate aggressive trauma care, and sheer biological resilience, Kelvin, Bruce, and Kenneth were stabilized and frantically transported to local surgical units. They would miraculously survive the night, effectively cheating the executioner. However, their survival was far from a total victory. The medical reality of high-velocity gunshot wounds dictates that the damage extends far beyond the initial puncture. The tissue destruction, nerve damage, and psychological trauma inflicted by Tuilaoipa would leave all 3 men with profound, permanently debilitating physical scars. Their bodies were fundamentally altered, destined to carry the agonizing physical memory of that Monday night for the rest of their natural lives. As the ambulances rushed away from the scene, their flashing red lights painting the exterior of the tavern, the space inside the Wander Inn transitioned from a medical triage center to an active, highly contaminated crime scene. The forensic investigation launched by the Long Beach Police Department was immediately confronted with the calculated, preemptive measures taken by the perpetrators. The deliberate choice to wear tight hairnets during the execution of the robbery presented a massive, frustrating hurdle for the crime scene technicians. In the 1980s, forensic science was rapidly evolving, and the perpetrators clearly understood the danger of leaving behind biological material. The hairnets had successfully prevented any hair fibers or easily retrievable genetic material from falling onto the bar floor during the violent physical struggle between Melvin Whidden and the accomplice. This clinical, premeditated sterilization of their own presence meant that the physical evidence left behind was strictly mechanical and ballistic. Investigators meticulously combed the blood-soaked floor and the bullet-scarred walls, conducting a painstaking grid search of the shattered room. Their efforts yielded a remarkably sparse collection of physical clues. Amidst the debris, they recovered exactly 3 spent shell casings and 2 deformed bullet projectiles. Analysis quickly confirmed that all the ballistic evidence originated from a .22 caliber weapon, confirming the exact mechanism of the massacre but offering very little in the way of identifying the specific man whose finger had pulled the trigger. With the physical and biological evidence intentionally minimized by the attackers, the entire weight of the investigation, the sole path to identifying and capturing the murderers, shifted entirely to the human element. The detectives had to rely on the fragile, highly subjective, and deeply traumatized memories of the surviving patrons. This is where the investigation encountered its most significant and profound twist, a revelation that would eventually form the unbreakable foundation of the prosecution's case. Interviewing victims immediately following a mass casualty event is a delicate, often fraught psychological process. The human brain, when subjected to extreme, life-threatening trauma, often fractures the encoding of memory. Details blur, sequences become jumbled, and the sheer volume of cortisol and adrenaline can wash away the specific characteristics of an attacker, leaving only a vague, terrifying impression of violence. The defense attorneys would later count on this very psychological phenomenon, assuming that the chaos, the darkness of the dive bar, and the rapid speed of the execution would render any eyewitness testimony unreliable and highly susceptible to reasonable doubt. However, the environment inside the Wander Inn bar contained a specific set of lighting conditions that entirely counteracted the typical obscuring effects of a dimly lit tavern. While the interior lighting was intentionally low to create a relaxing atmosphere, the exterior environment of the Long Beach street provided a stark, illuminating contrast. The establishment featured windows that allowed the harsh, unyielding glare of the municipal streetlights to pierce directly through the glass. This external illumination cut sharp, definitive angles through the smoky darkness of the bar. Furthermore, the sheer physical proximity of the violence played a crucial, devastating role in the formation of memory. Tuilaipa had not fired from a distance, hidden in the shadows near the doorway. He had aggressively closed the gap, standing mere feet, and in some cases mere inches, from his victims. When he leaned over the wooden counter to threaten Lee Malmstrom, when he marched down the aisles to snatch the wallets, and when he stepped forward to execute Melvin Whidden, he inadvertently stepped directly into the piercing beams of the streetlights. The hairnets, while successful in preventing the shedding of physical DNA, failed entirely in their secondary function of obscuring identity. They covered the hair, but they left the entire facial structure completely, undeniably exposed. In those agonizing, dilated seconds of sheer terror, as Tuilaipa threatened their lives and slaughtered their companions, his face was illuminated with terrifying clarity. The unique angles of his jaw, the specific set of his eyes, and the cold, unfeeling expression of his features were burned indelibly into the cognitive architecture of every single surviving patron in the immediate vicinity. The trauma did not blur his image. It chemically seared it into their minds with the absolute permanence of a photographic negative. This phenomenon transformed the survivors from mere victims into highly precise, entirely unshakable instruments of identification. As the detectives carefully separated the 8 surviving witnesses and began the arduous process of conducting individual interviews and presenting photographic lineups, a stunning, irrefutable pattern emerged. Without hesitation, without any cross-contamination of their accounts, and completely independent of one another, Every single one of the 8 survivors pointed directly and unequivocally to the exact same man. They identified Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa not with the tentative, fearful hesitation of traumatized victims, but with the absolute, cold certainty of people who have looked directly into the face of their own mortality. This unanimous, multi-layered identification was the ultimate investigative twist. The perpetrators had meticulously planned for physical forensics, utilizing hairnets to cheat the science of the era, but they had fundamentally underestimated the profound, unyielding power of human memory forged in the crucible of extreme trauma. The 8 survivors provided a web of identification so dense, so perfectly corroborated, and so deeply anchored in the terrifying reality of the lighting and proximity that it effectively sealed Tuilaepa's fate. The sheer statistical improbability of 8 completely separate individuals, all suffering from varying degrees of acute psychological shock and extreme physical trauma, independently selecting the exact same suspect from a vast array of potential faces provided the Long Beach police with an impenetrable investigative shield. Detectives working the case recognized immediately that this was not a circumstantial theory built on fragmented clues. This was a highly unusual, incredibly rare instance of absolute evidentiary certainty driven entirely by the human eye. The investigators painstakingly documented the exact lines of sight for each of the 8 witnesses, meticulously recreating the spatial dynamics of the tavern to prove in a court of law that each person had an unobstructed, brightly illuminated view of Tuilaepa's face during the commission of the crimes. They mapped out how the neon light from the beer signs intertwined with the harsh yellow glare of the street lamps outside, creating a tragic spotlight that tracked the killer's movements across the linoleum floor. This unprecedented level of eyewitness certainty allowed the district attorney's office to move forward with a staggering level of confidence. The lack of biological evidence, the missing hair fibers, and the absence of fingerprints on the recovered shell casings were entirely rendered moot by the unwavering, collective memory of the victims. The arrest warrant was swiftly drafted, heavily relying on the fact that Tuilaepa's attempt to remain anonymous had failed catastrophically at the very moment he decided to step out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the bar to pull the trigger. The physical hunt for the perpetrators concluded relatively quickly, but the capture of Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa merely marked the end of the violent physical confrontation and the immediate beginning of a far more complex, drawn-out intellectual and moral war. The 8 witnesses had provided the absolute identification necessary to physically bind the suspect in iron chains, but they had also unwittingly set the stage for a decades-long legal odyssey that would deeply question the very nature of culpability, intellectual capacity, and the absolute limits of the state's power to execute. The investigation was officially closed, completely locked down by the memories of the survivors, pushing the entire weight of the tragedy directly into the cold, sterile, and highly combative arena of the American judicial system. The transition from the blood-stained linoleum floor of the Wander Inn bar to the sterile, wood-paneled formality of the courtroom marked the beginning of a profound transformation in the nature of this tragedy. What began as a raw, visceral act of violence in a Long Beach tavern eventually evolved into a cold, meticulous, and agonizingly protracted battle over the fundamental principles of American law. As the judicial proceedings commenced, the courtroom became a stage where the absolute, unyielding horror of the victim's experience collided with the complex, abstract, and deeply controversial definitions of criminal responsibility. Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa, the man who had marched through the bar with a rifle, was now seated at the defense table, shackled, silent, and entirely alienated from the proceedings, an enigmatic figure whose very presence forced the state of California to confront the darkest corners of its own justice system. The primary strength of the prosecution's case rested entirely upon the foundation of eyewitness certainty, a foundation that had been solidified by the meticulous work of the Long Beach detectives. Throughout the trial, the prosecution painstakingly built a narrative of total identification. They brought forward the 8 survivors one by one, each forced to re-experience the most traumatic night of their lives in the presence of the man who had shattered their reality. The testimony was not merely a recounting of facts. It was a devastating display of human memory operating at its absolute peak under the pressure of mortal terror. Each witness described, with chilling specificity, the way the streetlights outside the Wander Inn had pierced through the tavern windows, casting a stark, artificial spotlight on Tuilaipa's face as he leaned over the counter and marched through the rows of terrified patrons. The jurors watched in silence as the witnesses, their voices sometimes trembling but their eyes never wavering, pointed directly at the defendant, identifying him as the man who had pulled the trigger of the .22 caliber rifle. This was not a tentative identification based on vague impressions or the passage of time. It was an act of absolute recognition that effectively neutralized any attempt by the defense to introduce reasonable doubt regarding the identity of the shooter. However, the defense strategy for Tuilaipa moved beyond the traditional arguments of mistaken identity or lack of physical evidence, which had been rendered obsolete by the unanimity of the witnesses. Instead, the defense team pivoted toward a far more controversial and intellectually challenging domain: the mitigation of culpability based on cognitive impairment. They presented to the court a deeply troubling psychiatric and neurological profile of the defendant. The evidence painted a picture of a man who was, by every clinical metric, severely cognitively disabled. He possessed an intelligence quotient that placed him squarely at the lower end of the cognitive spectrum, a deficit that profoundly affected his ability to perceive the consequences of his actions or to understand the gravity of the violence he had unleashed. Moreover, the defense highlighted the profound linguistic and cultural isolation that had defined Tuilaipa's existence since his arrival in the United States as a 5-year-old child. He existed in a state of double alienation, unable to master the English language while having simultaneously lost his connection to his native Samoan culture. This intellectual and linguistic void, the defense argued, meant that Tuilaipa did not operate within the framework of a rational, responsible citizen, but rather as an individual who was fundamentally incapable of the premeditated malice required to justify the ultimate penalty of death. The central conflict of the trial, therefore, was not whether Tuilaipa had pulled the trigger. The 8 witnesses had ensured that fact was beyond dispute, but rather what a civilized society should do with an individual who possesses the capacity for catastrophic violence, yet lacks the mental machinery to fully grasp the moral implications of that violence. The prosecution countered the defense's psychiatric narrative with a cold, relentless focus on the mechanical reality of the crime. They argued that the premeditation was evident in the actions themselves: the preparation of the khaki clothing, the deliberate purchase and use of the hairnets to subvert forensic science, the tactical decision to bring a long-barreled rifle into a confined space, and the calculated way in which Tuilaipa hunted the patrons who had already been robbed. The state argued that such an organized sequence of events could not be the work of a man who did not understand what he was doing. They positioned Tuilaipa not as a victim of his own disability, but as a predator who had utilized his limited cognitive resources to execute a mission of total domination and murder. The clash between these two perspectives, the defense's portrayal of a cognitively fractured man and the prosecution's depiction of a calculated murderer, created a tension that permeated every second of the trial. The climax of the trial came with the sentencing phase, where the jury was tasked with the most agonizing decision the American legal system permits: whether to sentence a man to death. The atmosphere in the courtroom during the deliberation of the penalty phase was suffocating. The jury was forced to weigh the absolute, immeasurable loss of Melvin Whidden, whose life was extinguished in a singular moment of unnecessary cruelty, against the documented reality of Tuilaipa's severe cognitive deficits. In 1992, the jury returned a verdict that was both final and heavily contested. Paul Palaloa Tuilaipa was sentenced to death. This decision was a direct reflection of the severity of the crimes and the jury's rejection of the defense's argument that cognitive impairment should preclude the ultimate penalty. For the families of the victims, the verdict provided a hollow, temporary sense of closure, a formal acknowledgement of the horror they had endured. But for the legal system, this verdict served as the spark for a far wider, more profound constitutional debate. The defense, refusing to accept the outcome, immediately initiated a multi-year appellate process that systematically moved the case up through the hierarchy of the American judiciary. The primary contention was that the California statutes governing the factors to be weighed in capital sentencing, specifically those related to the character and background of the defendant, were unconstitutionally vague. This argument served as the foundation for the landmark Supreme Court case, Tuilaepa v. California, argued in 1994. The legal question before the highest court in the land was not whether Tuilaepa was guilty. The facts of the massacre were already solidified by the evidentiary weight of the witnesses, but whether the criteria used to reach the death penalty in California violated the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court was effectively being asked to determine if the guidelines provided to the jury to consider the defendant's age, his background, and the circumstances of his crime were too broad, allowing for arbitrary and capricious sentencing. The oral arguments before the Supreme Court provided a masterclass in the complexities of the American legal system. The justices scrutinized the wording of the California law, debating whether it provided enough clarity to guide a jury through the deeply emotional and morally fraught task of choosing life or death. The defense argued that without precise, narrow criteria, juries are essentially empowered to sentence based on bias or raw emotion rather than objective, rational consideration. The state of California, conversely, argued that the discretion provided to the jury is a feature, not a bug, of the system. It allows the community, represented by the jury, to account for the totality of the circumstances, including the unique, horrific nature of the crime itself. The court's eventual ruling in 1994 upheld the California sentencing procedures, affirming that the criteria used by the jury were sufficiently focused to meet constitutional standards. This ruling was a significant blow to the defense and an affirmation of the state's sentencing powers. It effectively legitimized the jury's decision to prioritize the nature of the act over the cognitive limitations of the perpetrator. However, the ruling did not end the controversy. Instead, it set the stage for a decades-long persistence of appeals, where the defense team continued to introduce new evidence regarding Tuilaepa's neurological condition. They presented longitudinal studies, advanced forensic psychiatric evaluations, and expert testimonies suggesting that the brain damage Tuilaepa suffered was congenital and pervasive, rendering him incapable of the rational control required for true culpability. These appeals would continue into the 2000s and beyond, with each one serving as a testament to the persistent, nagging question that this case left in the wake of the initial trial. Can the state legitimately execute a man whose cognitive framework is fundamentally broken, regardless of how horrific his actions may have been? The trial and its subsequent legal journey revealed the limitations of a justice system designed to process binary guilt. It showed that when the facts of the crime are undeniable, the focus of the law shifts to the elusive, near-impossible task of weighing the value of a life against the depth of a disability. Throughout every phase of the trial, from the initial witness identifications to the final constitutional challenges, the figure of Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa remained a cipher. He was the perpetrator of an unforgettable massacre, a man who had left behind a legacy of shattered lives and, simultaneously, a man whose existence forced the American public to question the ethical integrity of their death penalty statutes. As the proceedings concluded and the appeals began their long, arduous path toward the present day, the trial remained a dark, haunting monument to the collision between mechanical justice and the complex, often broken reality of human cognition. The Wander Inn bar, which had once been a refuge for the working class, had been replaced in the public consciousness by the sterile, echoing halls of the justice system, where the question of life and death was debated not in the presence of beer and football, but in the cold, precise language of constitutional doctrine and psychiatric diagnosis. The case was never just about a robbery. It was about the fundamental, inescapable fragility of the moral order itself. The echoes of the gunfire that shattered the peace of the Wander Inn bar on that October night in 1986 have never truly faded into the silence of history. They resonate in the ongoing, agonizing legal saga of Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa, a man whose existence has become a permanent, uncomfortable fixture in the landscape of American constitutional law. Decades after the blood dried on the linoleum floor and the ambulance sirens ceased their wailing, the tragedy continues to unfold, not through the visceral terror of the crime itself, but through the endless, grinding machinery of the appellate system. The case of Tuilaoipa versus California stands today as a haunting, enduring reminder that for those who survive a mass casualty event, the conclusion of a trial is rarely the conclusion of the experience. The trauma sustained by the families of Melvin Whidden, Kelvin Whidden, Bruce Monroe, and Kenneth Boone is a living, breathing reality, a psychological burden that refuses to be neatly filed away alongside the dusty records of the court. Every time a new clemency appeal is filed, every time a new psychiatric evaluation is cited in a bid to commute a death sentence to life imprisonment, the survivors are forced to re-engage with the most painful, unresolved chapter of their lives, perpetually preventing the full, natural process of emotional recovery. This perpetual state of legal limbo highlights the profound, almost impossible dilemma at the core of the American justice system's relationship with the death penalty. At one end of this moral spectrum stands the undeniable, absolute nature of the crime committed. The massacre at the Wander Inn was not merely a robbery, it was an act of cold, calculated, and entirely indiscriminate destruction. Melvin Whidden, a man whose only decision was to protect his twin brother, was executed in a moment of pure, unadulterated savagery. The scars, both physical and psychological, carried by the other victims are permanent markers of that night, irreversible alterations to the trajectory of their lives. For the prosecution and the families of the victims, justice is a finite, objective concept. A life for a life, a finality that corresponds to the finality of the act itself. They view the persistent appeals not as a legitimate exercise of due process, but as a cruel, unnecessary prolongation of their suffering, a systemic refusal to acknowledge the absolute, objective nature of the horror inflicted upon them. At the other end of this spectrum stands the reality of the perpetrator. The defense, through years of painstaking psychiatric research and forensic neurological documentation, has consistently argued that Tuilaoipa is a fundamentally damaged human being. They point to congenital brain impairment, a cognitive deficit that essentially precludes the existence of true, premeditated malice as the law understands it. In their view, the American justice system is failing to live up to its own highest ideals if it insists upon the ultimate, irrevocable penalty of death for a man whose biological machinery is fundamentally broken. They argue that Tuilaoipa is not a monster in the traditional sense, but a tragic, hollow vessel of trauma, linguistic isolation, and intellectual disability, who is thrust into an American society he could never hope to comprehend. This perspective forces society to engage in the most difficult of moral inquiries. What is the limit of moral culpability when the cognitive foundation required for that morality is missing? Is the death penalty a form of justice, or is it a reflexive, societal rejection of the complexities of mental health and human suffering? These two opposing perspectives remain locked in a perpetual stalemate, a legal and moral tug-of-war that has persisted from the original sentencing in 1992 through the landmark Supreme Court arguments of 1994 and continuing all the way to the present day in 2026. The case has become a permanent, unavoidable test of the Eighth Amendment, forcing the judiciary to perpetually re-examine the boundaries of cruel and unusual punishment. It is a case that refuses to be solved, a ghost that continues to haunt the legal system, constantly demanding that we confront the terrifying instability of our own definitions of justice and mercy. As the decades have passed, the very nature of the discourse has shifted. The focus has evolved from the immediate, reactive outrage of the initial massacre to a more sterile, detached, and highly technical debate over the adequacy of California's capital sentencing guidelines and the evolving medical definitions of intellectual disability. Yet, underneath this dry, technical veneer, the tragedy remains fundamentally human. When we analyze the legal precedent, we must never lose sight of the people whose lives were irrevocably destroyed inside that Long Beach tavern. The significance of the case is not found in the legal abstracts of Tuilaoipa versus California, but in the quiet, empty spaces left behind in the lives of the survivors. The bravery displayed by Melvin Whidden, his split-second decision to defend his brother, remains an act of profound, enduring dignity that the slow, methodical pace of the appellate process cannot diminish. Similarly, the endurance of Kelvin Whidden, Bruce Monroe, and Kenneth Boone, men who lived through the nightmare and were forced to carry the weight of their physical and emotional trauma for 40 years, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their lives are the real, living arguments that transcend the technical debates in the halls of the Supreme Court. They remind us that for every abstract legal principle debated by scholars, there is a tangible, agonizing human cost that does not disappear simply because a gavel falls or a constitutional standard is reaffirmed. As we look toward the future, the case of Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa will undoubtedly continue to serve as a pivotal, highly contentious touchstone for future generations of legal scholars, ethicists, and policymakers. It is a case that exposes the fundamental, structural tensions within the American death penalty apparatus. It suggests that as long as we rely on the death penalty as a tool of criminal justice, we will be forced to repeatedly confront cases like this, cases where the crime is so heinous that it demands an absolute response, yet the defendant is so fundamentally flawed that the response begins to feel ethically compromising. We are left with a society caught in the middle, deeply divided on the value of retribution versus the necessity of rehabilitation and the inherent, unavoidable ambiguity of assessing the moral status of a damaged human mind. The tragedy of The Wanderer is that it provides no easy answers. It offers no clean, satisfying resolution. It leaves us with a fractured, incomplete narrative that mirrors the fractured, incomplete reality of the lives of everyone involved. In the final analysis, the story of this Monday night in 1986 is not a simple tale of a criminal being brought to justice, nor is it a simple story of an unfairly targeted individual. It is a complex, multi-layered meditation on the fragility of human existence, the absolute randomness of violence, and the exhausting, unending pursuit of a justice that feels increasingly elusive. The neon signs of the Wanderer may have long since been turned off, and the bar itself may have faded into the annals of city history, but the impact of that night continues to radiate forward, touching the present in ways that are as profound as they are deeply uncomfortable. As the appeals continue and the legal arguments remain unresolved, the case serves as a silent, persistent reminder that we are all living within the consequences of actions that took place long ago, actions that have permanently altered the moral landscape we navigate today. The only true resolution to this story is the recognition of its own permanence. The tragedy did not end when the gun stopped firing, and it will not end when the final appeal is finally exhausted. It is a permanent part of our collective, societal memory, a testament to the fact that when we allow the ultimate violence to enter our sanctuaries, we create a trauma that echoes through the generations, defying our attempts to silence it, and demanding that we forever confront the dark, unsettling reality of what we are capable of doing to one another and what we are capable of demanding in the name of justice. The lingering resonance of the massacre at the Wanderer in Bar does not merely inhabit the formal records of the Supreme Court or the heavy, leather-bound archives of the California penal system. Instead, it persists in the subtle, often overlooked ways that a single, cataclysmic event irrevocably recalibrates the moral and psychological compass of an entire community. When we examine the aftermath of such violence, we are forced to grapple with the reality that the event is not a singular point in time that concludes with a verdict or a sentencing. Rather, it is a persistent, expansive force that radiates through the lives of those who were present, those who lost loved ones, and even those who were simply members of the Long Beach working-class community that was fundamentally changed that night. The tragedy redefined what it meant to be a resident of that city, transforming the familiar, casual comfort of a neighborhood dive bar into a space imbued with a permanent, somber weight. It forced a collective confrontation with the terrifying randomness of violence, stripping away the illusion that societal routines and shared spaces are inherently safe from the intrusion of those who live on the fringes of human morality. For the survivors, the decades following the attack have been characterized by a complex, oscillating dance between the desire to bury the trauma and the impossibility of escaping it. The legal appeals, while technically procedural exercises designed to ensure the integrity of the constitutional process, act as persistent triggers, pulling the survivors back into the sensory details of that October night. Every time a new clemency bid is covered in the media, every time a new psychiatric assessment is released, the survivors are involuntarily transported back to the interior of the Wander Inn. They are back on the linoleum floor, hearing the deafening bark of the .22 caliber rifle, feeling the sudden, suffocating panic that defined those final, normal minutes of their lives. This continuous re-exposure to the trauma prevents the psychic scarring from ever truly healing. It turns their recovery into an ongoing project, a daily labor of managing the remnants of a tragedy that the legal system refuses to let fade into the background. The survivors are thus burdened with a dual reality. They must navigate the present-day pressures of their own lives while simultaneously serving as the living, breathing witnesses to a past that refuses to stay buried. The narrative of this case also forces us to consider the profound and often uncomfortable intersection of public policy and individual tragedy. The legal battle over Tuilaepa's fate has become a vessel for broader societal anxieties about the death penalty. It is a debate that transcends the specific, grotesque facts of the Long Beach massacre and speaks to the deeper, more unsettling question of how a democratic society justifies the act of state-sanctioned killing. When the law is forced to grapple with the cognitive limitations of a perpetrator, it is essentially trying to quantify the human soul, to determine the exact threshold at which a broken mind loses its status as a moral agent and becomes, instead, a pathology to be contained or discarded. This search for precision is inherently doomed to fail, as the reality of human behavior, particularly when defined by severe impairment and profound alienation, defies the rigid, binary logic of the courtroom. The case of Tuilaepa suggests that our legal instruments are woefully inadequate for the task of reconciling the absolute evil of an act with the fractured, incomplete reality of the human being who committed it. As we look at the legacy of this case in the current year of 2026, we must also recognize how it has shaped the professional lives of the many people who have touched its surface. Detectives, forensic experts, appellate lawyers, psychiatric evaluators, and jurists have all spent significant portions of their careers tethered to the facts of this single massacre. They have all, in their own ways, been forced to internalize the horror of the event, navigating the clinical and constitutional challenges of the case while managing the overwhelming human stakes involved. The case has served as a crucible for their professional expertise, testing the limits of their analytical capabilities and forcing them to maintain a difficult, often draining separation between their objective duties and the subjective reality of the loss. For these professionals, the Wander Inn case is not just a study in law or science. It is a permanent mark upon their career, a testament to the fact that their work always, ultimately, converges upon the fragile, irreplaceable value of the human life that was extinguished on that floor. We are also compelled to reflect on the nature of the society that produced this tragedy. The industrial, working-class world of 1986 Long Beach, with its reliance on manual labor, its pockets of profound isolation, and its reliance on neighborhood institutions, has undergone massive, seismic shifts in the intervening 4 decades. The physical landscape of the city has been modernized, the demographics have evolved, and the economic structures have been transformed. Yet, the underlying conditions of alienation, the gaps in mental health support, and the systemic difficulties of integrating marginalized individuals into the mainstream of American society remain as urgent and as unresolved as they were on the night of the shooting. The massacre serves as a grim, persistent marker of the cost of these systemic failures. It stands as an indictment of a society that could produce an individual so profoundly disconnected, so fundamentally shattered, that his only meaningful interaction with his community was an act of total, destructive erasure. This is the uncomfortable truth that the legal debates often obscure. The case is not just about the failure of one man, but about the collective failure of the structures that were meant to hold him, to guide him, and to prevent his eventual, violent descent into the void. Ultimately, the story of the Wander Inn Bar is a narrative of permanent loss and incomplete justice. It is a story that defies the conventional structure of a case-closed true crime chronicle. It is, instead, a study in endurance, the endurance of the trauma, the endurance of the legal process, and the endurance of the questions that refuse to be answered. The lives of the victims have become inextricably linked to the institutional machinery that has spent 40 years debating their sacrifice, a reality that feels deeply, profoundly unfair. Their legacy, however, is not found in the legal precedents or the scholarly articles that analyze the Eighth Amendment. It is found in the simple, powerful fact of their continued existence, in the survival of the victims who endured the impossible, in the love and persistence of the families who have demanded accountability for decades, and in the quiet, collective memory of a community that refuses to forget the individuals who were stolen from them in a moment of senseless, mechanical rage. This journey through the 7 parts of this narrative has been an attempt to honor that memory by refusing to look away from the horror, by refusing to simplify the complexity of the law, and by refusing to dehumanize the individuals whose lives were irreparably shattered. We are left, finally, with a profound sense of humility. We recognize that there are limits to what we can know, limits to what we can heal, and limits to what the law can provide. We are left with the silence of the room, the lingering smell of the cordite, and the enduring, unbreakable spirit of those who survived to tell the story. The case of Paul Palaloa Tuilaoepa will continue, as it has for 40 years, to challenge our understanding of justice and to test our capacity for empathy. It is a story that serves as an essential, if deeply painful, part of our national narrative. A reminder that justice is not merely the outcome of a court case, but a continuous, difficult struggle to acknowledge the value of every human life, especially in the face of actions that seek to deny it completely. As the sun sets on another day in this long, agonizing odyssey, we are left with the solemn, unshakable recognition that the only true resolution lies in our ongoing commitment to remember, to reflect, and to never treat the loss of our fellow human beings as a mere footnote in the history of the law. The Wander in case remains, above all else, a testament to the fragility of our sanctuaries and the persistent, unbreakable resilience of the human soul. The culmination of this long, agonizing exploration leads us not to a tidy resolution, but to a deeper, more solemn understanding of what it means to coexist in the wake of absolute atrocity. To reach this point, the 8th and final movement of our narrative is to accept that some stories are not designed to reach a finish line. They are designed to persist, embedded in the architecture of our societal conscience as a warning and a testament. The tragedy of the Wander in Bar has, over the course of 40 years, outgrown the confines of its original context. It is no longer just a crime committed in a Long Beach tavern. It has become an essential thread in the broader American tapestry of struggle, a reference point for every discussion regarding the intersection of cognitive disability, judicial retribution, and the profound, incurable nature of trauma. By tracing the arc from the initial, deafening silence of the massacre to the dry, academic precision of appellate litigation, we have observed the evolution of a single act of violence into a permanent, institutionalized dilemma. We must return, in this final reflection, to the human faces of those who were present. The legal system, by its very nature, demands that we strip away the subjective, emotional layers of human experience in favor of cold, rational facts. It requires the categorization of individuals into plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses, and jurors. Yet, for the people who endured the night of October 6, 1986, the humanity of the event is the only reality that matters. Melvin Whidden did not die for a constitutional precedent. He died for his brother. Bruce Monroe did not take a bullet for the sake of legal debate. He took it for his wife. Their actions were rooted in the immediate, uncalculating essence of human love, a force that stands in stark, irreconcilable opposition to the sterile, mechanical coldness of the .22 caliber rifle that ended their normalcy. The persistence of this case in the courts is, in many ways, an attempt to bridge the unbridgeable gap between this profound, spontaneous human sacrifice and the slow, deliberative pace of institutional justice. This journey has also required us to sit with the unsettling reality of the perpetrator. Paul Palaloa Tuilaoepa is a man who exists in a state of near-total social and cognitive exile. To look at him is to look at the catastrophic failure of integration. He represents the ultimate, terrifying outcome of a society that allows individuals to slip through every available safety net ending up in a place where their only remaining mode of engagement is through the application of lethal force. This is not to offer an excuse for his actions, for the absolute evil of the massacre remains untouched by his intellectual deficits. It is, rather, to acknowledge a disturbing truth. The society that sits in judgment of him is the same society that oversaw his alienation. We are forced to ask if the death penalty, in this specific instance, is truly a form of accountability, or if it is merely a final, irreversible mechanism for disposing of the evidence of our own collective failures to provide a functional existence for the most vulnerable among us. The resilience of the survivors stands as the most vital counter-narrative to the despair of the massacre. Kelvin Whidden, Bruce Monroe, and Kenneth Boone, men who were forced to carry the physical and psychological shrapnel of that night into their middle and old age, are the true keepers of this story. Their survival is not merely biological, it is a moral victory. By existing, by continuing to function, and by refusing to let the terror of that October night define the entirety of their human potential, they have committed an act of defiance that is every bit as significant as the bravery shown on the night of the shooting. They have navigated a world that constantly demands they justify their pain, that forces them to relive their deepest nightmares in the service of legal procedure, and yet, they have persisted. They remind us that the capacity for human recovery, while often fragmented and incomplete, is a profound testament to the strength of the human spirit. Their lives are the real, living monuments to those who are lost, far more meaningful than any plaque, record, or judicial opinion could ever be. As we conclude this reflection, we must acknowledge the broader context in which this narrative is situated. The world of 1986, with its specific industrial character and its reliance on local, communal spaces like the Wander Inn, has largely vanished. The modern digital age has fundamentally altered how we interact, how we conceptualize safety, and how we process collective trauma. Yet, the essential, terrifying fragility of our shared spaces remains exactly the same. We still gather in bars, in theaters and schools, and in public squares, operating under the same, unwritten assumption that our presence in a crowd is a form of protection. We still rely on the same, invisible, and deeply flawed mechanisms to maintain order. The massacre at the Wander Inn is not a relic of a bygone era. It is a warning that continues to ring out in the present day, a reminder that the sanctuary of our communal life is a fragile, conditional state, maintained by the mere absence of those who would choose to shatter it. This narrative has also served as a critique of the investigative and legal processes themselves. We have witnessed how forensic limitations in the 80s forced a reliance on the highly fallible, yet inexplicably powerful, instrument of human memory. We have seen how the pursuit of justice can become a recursive loop, a process that feeds upon its own history to justify its own continuation. The Wander Inn case teaches us that the law is not a neutral observer, but an active participant in the creation of trauma. It shows us that when the wheels of justice turn, they often grind down the very people they are intended to protect, requiring them to repeatedly revisit their darkest moments in order to satisfy the requirements of due process. This is the inherent, inescapable cost of the modern justice system, and it is a cost that is rarely accounted for in the sterile language of judicial rulings. Ultimately, the story of this case is an invitation to humility. It is a request for us to recognize that there are experiences which defy our attempts at total comprehension. We cannot fully understand the mindset of a killer who lives in a world of silent, intellectual void, nor can we fully grasp the internal architecture of a survivor who carries the memory of a brother's death for 4 decades. We must admit that there are parts of this story that will remain forever opaque, forever beyond our ability to map or measure. By accepting this, we allow the story to retain its gravity, its weight, and its capacity to change us. We stop trying to solve the case in our own minds, and instead, we begin to listen to what the tragedy is trying to tell us about ourselves, about our limitations, and about the fundamental, irreducible value of the lives we share. As we close this chapter, we leave the Wander Inn bar in the past, yet we carry its lesson into the future. The memory of the victims, The courage of the survivors and the agonizing persistence of the legal struggle are now part of our own historical framework. They are the invisible anchors that hold us in the present, reminding us that we are responsible for the sanctuaries we build and for the individuals we leave behind. The case of Paul Palaloa Tuilaepa will continue to unfold, perhaps for years more, in the silent, sterile chambers of the legal system, but its real meaning will always reside here, in the human heart, in the shared commitment to remember the lost, and in the ongoing, difficult work of creating a world that is less prone to the kind of darkness that defined that Monday night in October. We move forward, not with the arrogance of a conclusion, but with the quiet, determined perspective of those who have witnessed the depth of human destruction and have chosen, despite everything, to continue the work of being human together. The narrative of the Wanderer is now our own, a permanent, indelible part of how we understand justice, trauma, and the enduring power of the human spirit in an often indifferent, sometimes terrifying world. We do not look away, we do not minimize, and we do not forget. For it is in this act of collective remembering that we find the only true, lasting form of justice that this world can offer. The story of the Wanderer does not end. It is simply passed on, a silent, persistent, and vital inheritance that challenges us to look deeper, to care more, and to hold one another tighter in the face of the encroaching dark. This is the final, essential truth of the massacre. We are not just spectators to history, we are its guardians, and it is our solemn responsibility to ensure that the memory of those who were lost is never silenced, never diminished, and never forgotten, no matter how long the legal process continues or how much time passes. The sanctity of their lives remains our ultimate, unshakable focus, the guiding light through the long, complex, and deeply human journey that we all share. The finality of a narrative is often an illusion, a convenient boundary erected by the human desire for closure in a world that is fundamentally defined by its lack thereof. As we extend our contemplation beyond the initial 8 movements of this Odyssey, we find ourselves standing in a landscape of quiet observation, reflecting on the profound stillness that follows the cessation of the legal storm. The case of the Wanderer massacre, now stretching across 4 decades of human history, has entered a state of quiet, persistent existence, no longer a breaking news story or a current judicial crisis, but a permanent landmark in the topography of American tragedy. To sit with this reality is to acknowledge that justice, in its most idealized form, is an aspiration rather than a destination, a direction in which we must consistently strive even when the path is littered with the debris of broken lives and incomplete resolutions. The passage of time has acted as a slow, inexorable erosive force on the sharp edges of the initial horror, but it has only served to deepen the significance of the questions that remain. We find that in the absence of the loud, chaotic clamor of the trial, the essence of the tragedy settles into a profound, enduring meditation on the nature of societal responsibility and the irreducible value of individual existence. The silence that now envelopes the memory of the Wanderer is not empty. It is pregnant with the weight of the lives that were extinguished and the lives that were fundamentally altered. We have moved beyond the point where the legal arguments regarding constitutional vagueness or psychiatric impairment hold the same urgent primacy. Instead, we are left with the human residue of the event. We are forced to consider what it means to carry the memory of such a disaster through the shifting eras of American life. The survivors, as they grow older, have become the living, breathing repositories of this truth, their bodies and minds serving as the true, unyielding archives of what occurred on that October night. Their presence is a rebuke to any attempt to simplify or sanitize the history of the event. They remind us that the cost of the massacre was not a tally of dollars lost in a register or a series of court fees paid to the state. It was a permanent, non-negotiable tax levied upon the soul of every individual who survived the gunfire. This reality remains the absolute, irreducible center of the narrative, the point to which all other considerations, legal, academic, or moral, must eventually return. When we consider the broader impact of this tragedy on our collective understanding, we are led to the uncomfortable realization that the mechanisms we utilize to process such events are themselves part of the trauma. The legal system, with its rigid requirements for evidence, its obsession with the categorization of intent, and its reliance on the adversarial process, is a fundamentally cold instrument. It is designed to solve problems, not to heal wounds. By subjecting the survivors to the repetitive, grueling scrutiny of cross-examination and appellate review, the system effectively mandates a perpetual engagement with the original injury. We must ask ourselves if there is a more humane way for a society to demonstrate its commitment to justice without demanding that those who have already lost everything be forced to lose it again and again in the service of procedural integrity. The WhoDidIMarry case, in its nearly 40-year duration, serves as a poignant, if deeply distressing, example of how the pursuit of justice can, if left unchecked, become a form of secondary victimization. This reflection also brings us to the evolution of the role of the witness. In the early stages of the tragedy, the witnesses were participants in a life-or-death struggle, their survival dictated by the arbitrary movements of a man with a rifle. Later, they became the vital, necessary instruments of the prosecution, their memories serving as the anchor for the state's case. In this final phase of our contemplation, the witnesses have evolved into guardians of the truth, the only ones who can bear personal testimony to the reality that existed before the darkness descended. Their role is no longer to secure a conviction or to defend a precedent, but to ensure that the human dimension of the event is never entirely erased by the clinical language of the law. They are the ones who can tell us what the room felt like, what the fear tasted like, and what the loss meant in the quiet, private moments that the law can never touch. By honoring their testimony, we are not just analyzing a crime. We are participating in a communal act of remembrance that elevates the narrative above the mechanical and into the realm of the profound. The institutional legacy of the case is likewise undergoing a quiet, reflective reassessment. The Supreme Court's 1994 ruling, which provided such a definitive, albeit controversial, affirmation of the death penalty's procedural constitutionality, is now viewed through a much longer, more critical lens. We can now see how the case acted as a threshold, a moment when the judiciary attempted to codify the morality of execution in a way that would withstand the scrutiny of future generations. Yet, the persistent appeals and the ongoing, shifting understanding of cognitive disability have demonstrated that the law is not a static object but a living, breathing creature that reacts to the evolving ethics of the society it serves. The WhoDidIMarry case remains a point of departure for all modern discussions on capital punishment, providing the necessary contrast between the cold, categorical application of the law and the messy, nuanced reality of human fallibility. It is a touchstone that forces us to reconcile our desire for retribution with the increasing recognition that our societal structures, from the schools to the mental health services, are deeply complicit in the outcomes we later seek to punish. As we look across the landscape of our own time, we are reminded that the conditions that allowed for the WhoDidIMarry massacre are not confined to the past. The isolation, the alienation, and the sudden, violent eruptions of individuals who have become detached from the human community are perennial features of our shared experience. The massacre was a manifestation of a specific moment and a specific set of circumstances, but its underlying themes are universal. We are tasked, then, not just with analyzing the past, but with applying the lessons of the tragedy to the present. We must be more vigilant in our recognition of the signs of disconnection, more robust in our support of communal spaces that provide genuine safety and connection, and more honest about the failures of our social safety nets. This is the only way to transform the memory of the WhoDidIMarry from a source of perpetual despair into a catalyst for a more conscientious, more attentive form of community. We find ourselves, finally, in a state of quiet acceptance regarding the narrative's conclusion. There is no triumphant resolution, no sudden, miraculous healing, and no final, satisfying explanation that makes the loss of Melvin Whidden any less devastating. There is only the long, slow, and necessary work of living in the shadow of what occurred and refusing to let that shadow dictate the entirety of our future. We carry the memory of the night with a newfound sense of responsibility, acknowledging that the sanctity of our lives is a shared, mutual endeavor that requires our constant, unyielding attention. The WhoDidIMarry case, in its long, winding journey through the courts and into the annals of history, has served its purpose by forcing us to hold the mirror up to our own collective conscience. It has shown us what we are capable of, what we are willing to fight for, and what we must change if we are to prevent the recurrence of such profound, unnecessary darkness. The quiet that now reigns where the tavern once stood is the quiet of reflection, not the quiet of oblivion. We leave the narrative behind, but we do not leave the lesson. We move forward, carrying the weight of the past not as an anchor, but as a compass, guiding our interactions, our policy decisions, and our fundamental understanding of one another. The individuals who were there, the brave, the broken, and the lost, are now part of the foundational bedrock of our societal awareness. Their stories have been told, their struggles documented, and their existence honored through the long, patient effort of remembrance. This is the ultimate act of defiance against the violence that sought to silence them, to speak their names, to respect their memory, and to ensure that the lessons of their tragedy continue to resonate, informing a future where the sanctuary of human connection is valued above all else. We close this final chapter with a sense of solemn, unshakable purpose. The Odyssey of the Wanderer is complete, yet its echoes are timeless. We have explored the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the long, wearying aftermath of the appeals, always returning to the same fundamental truth, that the life we share is fragile, that the institutions we build are flawed, and that our only true defense against the darkness is the persistence of our empathy and the strength of our resolve to never let the memory of the lost be extinguished. This is the legacy we carry, a legacy forged in the heat of a Monday night in October and refined through the slow, agonizing, and necessary process of remembering. We leave the story of the Wanderer into history, confident in the knowledge that we have done our part to honor the sanctity of the lives it took and to illuminate the path for those who will come after, ensuring that they, too, may understand the gravity of our shared human experience. The silence is no longer an absence, but a presence, a reminder, a challenge, and a solemn, enduring promise to remain ever vigilant in our pursuit of a world where justice is not just a procedural formality, but a living, breathing reality for all who suffer. The finality of a narrative is not found in the resolution of its legal entanglements nor in the eventual silence of the media, but in the permanent integration of its tragedy into the fabric of the collective human experience. As we arrive at this 10th and concluding movement of our profound contemplation, we find that the massacre at the Wanderer in Bar has moved beyond the status of a historical event or a legal precedent. It has become a fundamental, existential benchmark by which we measure our capacity for endurance in the face of senseless, mechanical destruction. To exist in the wake of such a disaster is to exist within a permanent state of reevaluation, where the mundane realities of daily life are constantly juxtaposed against the fragile, terrifying vulnerability that was exposed on that October night in 1986. This final reflection serves not as an attempt to close the book on a tragedy that refuses to be contained, but as a commitment to the ongoing, essential work of living with the truth of what occurred, recognizing that our ultimate defense against the encroaching darkness is our shared, unwavering resolve to keep the memory of the light alive. The survivors of the Wanderer, Kelvin Whidden, Bruce Monroe, and Kenneth Boone, stand as the primary, living architects of this reality. Their journey through the decades has been one of quiet, monumental transformation. By surviving the carnage, they were not simply granted a second chance at life. They were thrust into a lifelong, involuntary apprenticeship in the management of profound trauma. Their persistence serves as a defiant, silent testimony to the fact that the human spirit, while fundamentally altered by violence, possesses an extraordinary capacity to reconstruct meaning from the ruins of devastation. They have carried the names of those who were lost, particularly Melvin Whidden, with a dignity that transcends the clinical observations of the courtroom. Their lives are the true, living responses to the question of whether a tragedy of such magnitude can ever be overcome. They prove that while we may never fully overcome the loss of our loved ones or the shattering of our reality, we can learn to carry the weight of that history without allowing it to crush the possibility of a future. When we turn our attention toward the institution of the law, we are reminded that our judicial systems are built upon the same flawed, fragile foundations as the societies they serve. The lengthy, agonizingly slow appellate process surrounding Paul Palaloa Tuilaoepa has revealed the deep, structural tensions between the letter of the law and the inherent, messy nuance of human existence. The law seeks to provide certainty, but the reality of a man like Tuilaoepa, a man defined by intellectual disability, linguistic isolation, and congenital neurological impairment, is a reality of profound ambiguity. This tension is not a defect to be corrected, but a fundamental characteristic of a society that claims to value both the objective administration of justice and the subjective, empathetic recognition of human frailty. The Wander-in case forces us to acknowledge that justice is not a static, finished product, but a continuous, often painful negotiation between these competing, essential values. It challenges us to build a future where the law is not just a tool for retribution, but a framework that recognizes the complexity of the human condition and the systemic failures that often precede the commission of the most violent acts. As we look back at the nearly 40-year arc of this investigation, trial, and post-trial litigation, we must also recognize the quiet, dedicated work of the countless individuals who have moved through the orbit of this case. The detectives who painstakingly searched the blood-soaked floor for evidence, the legal professionals who argued the constitutional nuances before the Supreme Court, and the psychiatrists who attempted to map the fractured landscape of the perpetrator's mind. All of these individuals have contributed to the immense, sprawling corpus of human knowledge surrounding the tragedy. They have played their parts in a larger, collective effort to bear witness, to record the facts, and to grapple with the ethical implications of the event. Their labor has not been in vain. It has provided us with a comprehensive, if profoundly painful, record of our own capacity to respond to the worst of humanity with the best of our analytical, legal, and forensic capabilities. This record is our inheritance, a detailed map of our own institutional strengths and weaknesses that we must use to navigate the challenges that lie ahead. The legacy of the Wander-in also functions as a stark, indelible reminder of the value of the communal space. In our current, digitized era, the physical taverns, neighborhood bars, and local gathering spots have often been replaced by virtual, ephemeral landscapes that lack the tangible, human connection of a shared physical environment. Yet, the tragedy reminds us that the physical space is the crucible of our humanity. It is in the physical presence of one another, in the clinking of glasses, the shared viewing of a game, and the unscripted, spontaneous interaction that we forge the connections that give our lives their richness and their stability. The violation of that physical space is an attack on the very mechanism of our communal health. By remembering the Wander-in, we are affirming the importance of these gathering places and committing ourselves to protecting the sanctity of our shared physical lives, ensuring that we remain vigilant against those who would seek to weaponize our own openness against us. This narrative has also challenged us to confront the reality of our own internal landscapes. We have looked at the darkness, we have analyzed the violence, and we have navigated the labyrinth of the legal struggle, but the most important work happens within the quiet, internal spaces of our own reflection. We are challenged to look at the perpetrator not with a simple, satisfying mask of a monster, but with the uncomfortable, necessary recognition that he is a product of a world we all share. We are challenged to look at the victims not as statistics or symbols of loss, but as complex, vibrant individuals whose sudden absence left a hole that can never be filled. This act of empathetic recognition is the final, ultimate defense against the coldness that the massacre attempted to introduce into our world. By refusing to simplify, by refusing to dehumanize, and by refusing to forget, we exercise the very qualities that the tragedy sought to eradicate: our capacity to see, to feel, and to hold one another in our collective memory. As we bring this 10-part chronicle to its conclusion, we find ourselves standing in a new light, one that is filtered through the lens of all that we have analyzed, discussed, and remembered. We are no longer the same individuals who began this investigation. We have been marked, in some small but significant way, by the gravity of the Wander-in massacre. The history of that October night has become a part of our own historical framework, an invisible weight that informs our present and guides our approach to the future. We move forward with a sober, grounded understanding that our work is never truly finished. The quest for a world that is more attentive to the needs of the vulnerable, more protective of the sanctuaries we build, and more dedicated to the principle of justice for all is a quest that demands our constant, vigilant, and compassionate participation. We do not walk away from the memory of the wanderer. We carry it with us, a permanent, sacred trust that compels us to act, to listen, and to cherish the precious, fragile nature of the life we have been given. The silence that now returns to the site of the former tavern is not an empty one. It is a silence that is filled with the echoes of everything we have learned, every question we have posed, and every commitment we have made to ensure that the tragedy is never lost in the shuffle of time. We leave this chronicle here, confident in the knowledge that the record of the massacre is complete, the dignity of the lost is honored, and the strength of the survivors is permanently etched into our collective memory. The case of Paul Palaloa Tuilaoepa will continue to reside in the archives of the court, but the story of the wanderer, the real, human, and enduring story, will live on in the hearts of those who have chosen to remember. We look toward the horizon with a sense of solemn, quiet purpose, knowing that our collective journey through the dark has left us more prepared to embrace the light. The work of remembrance is complete, the duty of reflection is fulfilled, and the spirit of our shared, communal humanity remains, as it always has been, the strongest, most resilient force against the encroachment of the void. We proceed with the knowledge that we have honored the lives that were taken, we have respected the courage of those who remained, and we have done our part to ensure that the memory of the wanderer remains a vital, life-affirming beacon for all who understand the true, irrevocable value of a human life. The Odyssey ends here, but the echo of our collective, human resilience will continue to resonate, reminding us that no matter how dark the night, no matter how heavy the weight, we are capable of carrying one another through to the other side. As we venture into this 11th movement, we find ourselves transcending the boundaries of a specific historical case to enter a realm of universal truth concerning the nature of justice and the enduring, unbreakable sanctity of human life. The tragedy of the wanderer has become something far greater than its original components. It has evolved into a persistent, silent monitor of our societal conscience, a touchstone that we return to not to uncover new facts, but to recalibrate our moral alignment. To engage in this final extension of the narrative is to acknowledge that the pursuit of justice is not a task that can be completed within the confines of a courtroom, but a lifelong, intergenerational commitment to recognizing the absolute, infinite worth of the individuals whose lives were violently interrupted. We move now beyond the legalities, beyond the psychiatric debates, and even beyond the personal history of the victims, to sit in the quiet, reflective space of what it means to carry the burden of memory in a society that so often prefers to forget. The ongoing legal status of the perpetrator, despite the immense passage of time, continues to act as a tether, pulling the entire history of the wanderer back into the present day. This temporal stretching is in itself a commentary on the nature of the American death penalty. It illustrates how a single, irrevocable act of violence can fundamentally warp the experience of time, creating a state of perpetual engagement where the past is never permitted to retreat into the safe, dusty corners of history. For the American judiciary, the case of Tuilaoepa is a testament to the profound difficulty of balancing the demand for finality with the necessity of due process. For the survivors, this same persistence is a reminder that the trauma they endured is not a static object they can set down, but a dynamic, evolving reality that continues to shape their engagement with the world. We are forced to consider the profound, ethical weight of this state of being, where the resolution of a crime is perpetually deferred, forcing all involved to maintain a vigil over the memory of the loss. There is a significant, often unspoken, burden placed upon those who survive such an experience. They are expected to be resilient, to move forward, and to integrate their trauma into the broader context of a productive, stable existence. Yet, the case of the wanderer demonstrates that this expectation is fundamentally at odds with the reality of profound psychological damage. The survivors have been tasked with the impossible, to live a full life in the shadow of a massacre while serving as the primary witnesses to the truth of what happened. This dual burden has defined their journey, shaping their relationships, their perspectives on safety, and their understanding of the world. By honoring their journey, we are forced to re-examine our societal relationship with those who have survived extreme violence. We are challenged to create a culture that is more attentive to the complexities of recovery, more supportive of the ongoing needs of the traumatized, and more respectful of the fact that for many, the healing process is not a linear path, but a lifelong navigation of a fractured terrain. The lessons of this case also resonate deeply within the broader context of our societal commitment to the vulnerable. If we accept the premise that the perpetrator was, at his core, a product of systemic failure, a man left to drift in the void of a society that could not integrate his specific, complex needs, then we are all, in some measure, responsible for the conditions that fostered his descent into violence. This is the most uncomfortable truth of the Wanderin, that the violence we fear is often a manifestation of the very failures we refuse to address in our daily, institutional lives. By recognizing this, we are challenged to move beyond the reflexive desire to punish and into a more proactive, systemic commitment to preventing such failures in the future. We must cultivate a society that is not merely reactive to the outcome of tragedy, but one that is fundamentally dedicated to the cultivation of connection, the provision of support, and the early intervention in the lives of those who show the first, faint signs of detaching from the community. We must also reflect on the role of the environment in the creation of tragedy. The Wanderin was a sanctuary that was turned into a site of slaughter, a transformation that fundamentally altered the meaning of safe space for everyone involved. This tragedy highlights the fact that our physical environments are not merely the containers for our lives. They are the active, influential contexts that shape our safety, our community, and our very survival. The loss of the Wanderin as a physical site is a loss of a specific, tangible connection to the past, but the memory of what happened there remains a permanent, invisible marker of our shared vulnerability. By continuing to talk about the Wanderin, we are claiming those spaces, in our memory, in our reflection, and in our communal life, and ensuring that the darkness which once occupied them is replaced by the enduring, vital light of our collective understanding. As we traverse this 11th stage of our contemplation, we also recognize the evolving nature of the evidence itself. In 1986, the case was built on the raw, immediate memory of the survivors. Today, it is sustained by the sophisticated, multi-layer documentation of 4 decades of legal and psychiatric analysis. The transition from the immediate, sensory reality of the massacre to the abstract, clinical reality of the case files is a transformation that mirrors our own societal maturation. We have learned to process the trauma of the event through the filter of more advanced forensic, psychiatric, and legal understandings, yet the core of the tragedy remains remarkably, stubbornly simple. It is the story of human life, of the violent intrusion of the end, and of the persistent, defiant choice to continue in the wake of the loss. This simplicity is the source of the story's enduring power. It is why we keep returning to it, why we continue to analyze it, and why we will continue to honor the memory of the victims long after the final appeal has been heard. The spirit of the victims and the fortitude of the survivors now acts as a beacon for our collective journey. When we speak of Melvin Whidden, we are speaking of the capacity for selfless love. When we speak of the survivors, we are speaking of the capacity for resilience. These are the qualities that we must carry forward, the essential building blocks of the more humane, more connected world we strive to create. We carry these memories not as a burden of despair, but as a source of strength, knowing that we have witnessed the worst of what humanity can do and have remained, nonetheless, committed to the best of what humanity can be. This commitment is the true legacy of the Wanderin, a legacy that transcends the law, the trauma, and the tragedy, and anchors itself in the fundamental, irreducible truth of our shared human existence. We are not just remembering the past, we are actively constructing a future that is informed by the gravity of our history. We find ourselves now at the threshold of a new, deeper level of understanding. We have looked at every aspect of this massacre, from the dark, cold streetlights of Long Beach to the high, echoing chambers of the Supreme Court, and we have come to recognize that the story is not one that ends with a single individual or a single decision. It is a story about the complex, often broken, and fundamentally intertwined nature of the lives we live. We recognize that our personal existence is tethered to the existence of others, and that the violence committed against one is, in some sense, a violence committed against us all. This recognition is the foundation of our shared, moral duty. It is the reason we refuse to look away, the reason we refuse to simplify, and the reason we continue to demand that the truth of the Wander be told with the full, unflinching gravity it deserves. As we bring this 11th movement to a close, we stand in a state of quiet, resolute clarity. The Odyssey of the Wander is an enduring, essential part of our shared narrative, a testament to the fact that while our institutions may falter and our personal lives may be shattered, our capacity to remember, to reflect, and to stand together remains our greatest, most indestructible strength. We walk forward with the memory of the Wander in our hearts, knowing that we are now the guardians of a truth that must never be allowed to fade. We have honored the lost, we have stood with the survivors, and we have done our part to articulate the complexity of a tragedy that will forever serve as a vital, necessary part of our moral and legal history. The journey continues, the echo of the past informs the future, and our commitment to one another remains the constant, guiding force through the long, complex odyssey of our shared human experience. We leave this 11th stage with the knowledge that we have been changed, that we have learned, and that we are now more prepared to face the complexities of the world, sustained by the memory of the Wander and the profound, enduring power of the truth we have chosen to honor, to hold, and to forever keep alive in our collective understanding of what it means to be human in an often indifferent, sometimes profoundly terrifying, yet always, ultimately resilient world.